Well guys, it's Christmas 2023, and it's time to review Thomascember once again. Since the last 2 years I've reviewed Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends Series 1 and 2 episode by episode, I'm going to carry on with that tradition this year by reviewing Series 3. Episode by episode, of course. I'll be talking about each episode of the third series, its production values, the characters that were introduced to it, and just a few odd little facts about the show. And I know you guys are expecting me to review the last CGI series as well as the last DVD special that was released for the CGI series, but I honestly just haven't had that much time to look at those this year. I've been so busy with work lately and a bunch of other stuff that's been going on in the recent months that I just haven't had time to look over that lot of Thomas. So this year is solely going to be Series 3 of the classic series. Episode by episode, Trivial Pursuit facts, and other odds and sods about the episodes and characters that are introduced in the series, as well as some of the facts about the episodes that were based on stories by the Audrey family and stories that weren't based on the Audrey family, since this was the first series to use non-Audrey related stories. And with all that out of the way, let's dive right into Thomascember 2023. Now before we dive into the first episode of Series 3, I want to talk about something that not that many people talk about for Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. The hiatus that went on in between the second series and the third series. Mainly all the things that happened with the production team during the hiatus. And I'm going to start off with Britt Allcroft. After the success of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends in the United Kingdom, Britt Allcroft set her sights in distributing the show in the United States of America. And so while the team was on a break from making Thomas the Tank Engine series, Britt Allcroft herself was off to America. When Britt originally pitched the idea for Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends to be shown in the United States of America, the TV stations didn't really like the idea because their shows at the time were 20-minute episodes, whereas in the UK a lot of our children's shows at that time were 5 to 10-minute episodes for each series, and American stations like to have 20-minute to half-hour programs, so 5-minute shorts just weren't going to cut it. So Britt Allcroft decided to improvise and create a new American exclusive show to show the Thomas the Tank Engine episodes on. So with the help of Rick Sigelko, they came up with Shining Time Station, a sitcom-esque show starring Ringo Starr, George Carlin, Didi Conn, Brian O'Connor, and many others. Every single episode of the show would include a couple of episodes of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. Since Sir Ringo Starr had already provided the narrations for the British version of the show, he agreed to extend the role and to include the on-screen character called Mr. Conductor. And while the episodes remained mostly untouched, he went back and re-recorded a couple of lines that would fit in with the American audiences, like calling brake vans cabooses, trucks freight cars, the fat controllers to top 'em hats since the word fat is offensive in America apparently. And then Bob's Your Uncle, out came Shining Time Station. After the first season of Shining Time, Sir Ringo left the show after his initial season to focus on his musical career and was replaced by George Carlin. Shining Time Station received critical acclaim. In a review for Entertainment Weekly, Ken Tucker states that compared to the faster paced Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, Shining Time Station wants to slow things down. It's an old-fashioned show that creates a gentle, luring atmosphere and to convince children that life is fun and that trains are the way to travel. It was a rating success as well. In its first season, the show averaged a 0.9 Nielsen rating, translating to about 1.2 million viewers on average. At the peak of its popularity, the show brought in up to 7.5 million viewers per week. The show premiered on the 29th of January 1989 and ended in 1995, with all the actors going on to do their own things. Meanwhile, back in the UK, David Mitton teamed up with Thomas the Tank Engine producer Robert de Cardenet to produce Tugs, a series that consisted of 13 15-minute episodes, though 4 exist as 20-minute episodes on Tugs VHS tapes, each told by the show's narrator Captain Star, played by the late Patrick Allen. The filming and production of the series took place throughout 1987 and 1988 at Shepton Studios, Middlesex, where Thomas and Friends was also filmed at the time. As we all know, the series was made using live-action models much like Thomas the Tank Engine, which was seen as the most realistic method of portraying real tugboats. The set featured the Clearwater periscope lens system, a type of professional video camera used to film at the model's eye level. And the show was originally going to have a second series, but the studio ended up running out of money, so they had to cancel the second series. As of now, the show has never been released on DVD like the late David Mitton had originally intended to do, but most of the models from the show were put on display at Tug's The Exhibition at the Midland Railway in Butterley, and continues to be displayed there to this day. After Clearwater's liquidation in 1990, Mitton joined the Britt Allcroft Company to continue working on Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends in 1991, while Cardenay went on to direct Theodore Tugboat, a similarly natured series set in Canada. And some of the Tugs models were bought by Britt Allcroft's company to feature in the background of Thomas the Tank Engine episodes, including various boats, Big Mickey the Crane, and so on and so forth. And that's the complete history of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends' hiatus between Series 2 and Series 3. I hope you guys found this little history lesson interesting, and I thought it'd be nice to talk about since not that many people talk about it on the internet. I just felt it was a subject that was worth shedding some light on, and we'll officially start with Series 3 tomorrow. Like the previous 2 years, production history first, episode last. Before production of the third series, Clearwater Features closed down, with the Britt Allcroft Company becoming the sole producer of Thomas. Producer Robert D. Cardenay departed before the third series, and Britt Allcroft took his place as co-producer alongside David Mitton. The series was a mix of stories derived from the Railway series, magazine stories written by the series' future head writer Andrew Brenner. Yep, the Andrew Brenner, the guy who would eventually become the head writer for the CGI series, and a couple of original stories written by Allcroft and Mitton. One of the primary reasons for diverging from the original books was that many of the stories not yet adapted featured large numbers of new characters, which would be expensive to produce. Another reason was that the producers wanted more stories about Thomas, the nominal main character, as well as the other already established characters. According to Steve Asquith, it was felt that some of the original stories were repetitive and too storybook orientated. The Reverend Wilbert Awdry took umbrage with the looser adaptations of the stories and publicly criticised the original episodes, particularly Henry's Forest, for the lack of realism and how Thomas was, as he put it, crane-shunted into some of these episodes. The third series of the show was first released exclusively on VHS in the UK on the 11th of November 1991. Originally, only the first 16 episodes were released on VHS before all 26 episodes aired on UK television starting on the 25th of February 1992. And in the US, the first 16 episodes aired on Shining Time Station in November 1991, and final 10 episodes airing in 1993. As we all know, Sir Ringo Starr left the production after the second series of the show, and so he was replaced by the late Michael Angelis for the UK, and George Carlin in the US. And Michael Angelis has been narrating the show since the 90s, and he's become the longest running narrator for the UK dub of the show. And those two exclusive VHS tapes, Time for Trouble and Other Stories, and Trust Thomas and Other Stories, were how I was introduced to Series 3. And if I remember correctly, Trust Thomas was my first ever Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends VHS tape. So as you can imagine, I grew up with the early narrations of this series. So any sound clips you may hear for the first 16 episodes for this series will mostly be from the early narrations, because while I do like both versions of the narrations, I just grew up with the early narrations more, and I find that some of the later narrations for the first 16 episodes sounded a little bit rushed, as if Michael Angelis thought, do I really have to re-record these lines again? It was perfect the way it was. I don't know if that's how it actually went, but the way he went through the second recordings, it made it seem like that. And with all that out of the way, let's get down to the first episode of the third series, A Scar for Percy, based on Percy and the Trousers from the Railway series book Henry and the Green Engine. This is one of the episodes that ended up being better than the original book story, and I'll explain why after I go through the story. It is a very cold winter morning on the island of Sodor, with Thomas and Percy in the sheds feeling the brunt of it. Thomas complains that their firelighter is late, but Percy tells them that the cold actually woke them up early. As the wind and snow make the two engines even colder, the two decide to take their minds off the weather by talking about warm fins in hopes that they will feel less cold as a result. Percy lists off some fins known for keeping away the cold, and his mind soon turns to scarves, to which Thomas jokes that Percy needs a nice warm scarf around his funnel. But while he was only joking, Percy thinks happily of how warm a scarf would be until the firelighter finally arrives. The Fat Controller is much warmer that morning, as he is enjoying hot porridge for breakfast while looking forward to taking some visitors on a tour of the island. He tells his wife Ladyhand that he has pressed his best trousers and will put them in his trunk ready to be changed into when the photographs are being taken. He then leaves to catch his train. Soon Percy is hard at work, still thinking about scarves, which is not helped by seeing one on everyone everywhere he goes. He complains about his cold funnel to Henry, telling him he wants a scarf. Henry tells Percy that engines don't wear scarves, but Percy retorts that Henry cannot because his funnel is too small. Henry is insulted, but Percy, still fuming, puffs away before he can answer, and even the bigger engines are scoffed off as he prepares to pull the special train. At the station, it is nearly time for the photographs, and the Fat Controller is waiting anxiously for his trousers, which are in a trunk on a baggage trolley being carried across the line. The two porters pulling the trolley walk backwards to ensure nothing falls off, but they are also unable to see what is coming. Percy, still feeling cheeky, arrives at the station and his driver shuts off steam as usual. Percy decides to startle the coaches by coming in as quietly as possible. However, he is so quiet that the porters do not hear him either. Percy does not stop until it is too late. He crashes into the trolley and frightens the porters. The force of the impact sends the luggage and a crate of jam flying into the air. Jam ends up splattering across Percy, the Fat Controller, and the passengers, while a top hat lands on Percy's lamp iron and a best pair of trousers end up wrapping themselves around his funnel as if it was a scarf. Everyone is very angry, especially the Fat Controller, who seizes his hat before discovering what has become of his trousers, making him even angrier. He tells Percy that now they will have to pay the passengers for their ruined clothes, and warns him never to play tricks on coaches again. Percy feels very silly and quickly leaves for the yard. Percy soon encounters James, who jokes that Percy found a scarf after all and runs off to tell Henry the news. That night, Thomas and the now clean Percy prepare to go to sleep, happy that the firelighter has agreed to come early the next morning. Henry arrives, having enjoyed taking the passengers on their tour, and feels sorry for Percy. However, he cannot resist a small joke as he mentions that the weather is meant to be warmer the next day and that there will be no need for a scarf. Percy assures that not only is he now aware that engines need warm boilers, but he secretly knows that he hates scarves anyway. This is quite a unique episode for the TV series at the time, as it's the first one to be set during winter time and have snow, because the previous two seasons didn't have a snow-themed episode or winter-themed episode as a starter, which makes this one the first to have it. And you remember when I said that this adaptation was better than the actual book? It was mainly due to the fact that the story in the book is actually really short compared to the other stories in that book. Not to mention the fact that it has nothing to do with the Henry the Green Engine plot. It just exists in between Gordon's whistle and Henry's sneeze, so it's more like a filler story. And there's no real explanation to why Percy would want a scarf other than seeing everyone wearing one and just thinking, ooh, I can wear a scarf too. But in the adaptation, it's Thomas who gives Percy the idea, saying that he needs a woolly scarf around his funnel, and even though he was only joking about it, Percy took it literally. Much like how he took the backing signals thing literally, since Percy was still young and naive and easily believed in anything he was told. There's also the fact that the story tells us that it's a frosty day, but the illustration shows no evidence of frost there. It just looks like a regular dry day. Whereas in the TV adaptation, they show and say that it's a cold winter morning and that it actually snows. So this gives a proper reason for everyone to wear scarves on that day, rather than just having a clear sunny day in the illustration and saying, oh, it's really cold. Yeah, from the illustration, you just don't get that notion that it's cold and frosty. Which is where the TV series version succeeds, having it actually snow and making it look like it's a day where you should be wrapped up warm with scarves. And this was an episode I've always looked forward to watching whenever I put on Time for Trouble and other stories when I was a kid. I especially loved the little banter between Percy and Henry in the middle of the episode.
My funnel's cold, he puffed. I want a scarf. Rubbish, Percy, said Henry. Engines don't wear scarves. Engines with proper funnels do, replied Percy. You've only got a small one.
And the episode has become one of the most iconic parts of the TV series to date. It was so iconic that a CGI series recreation of the scene where Percy crashes into the baggage trolley is made for Blue Mountain Mystery as a reference to the episode in that special. And I'm going to go over a slight narration difference in this episode. It's in the scene where the Fat Controller scolds Percy for his little trick. In the early narration on the VHS tape, the Fat Controller sounds completely pissed off about the whole thing.
The Fat Controller sees the top hat. Mine, he said. Percy, look at this. Yes, sir. I am, sir. My best trousers, too. Yes, sir. Please, sir. We must pay the passengers for their spoiled clothes. And my trousers are ruined. I hope this will teach you not to play tricks with the coaches.
Whereas in the redone version of it, he sounds a little calmer.
The Fat Controller sees the top hat. Mine, he said. Percy, look at this. Yes, sir. I am, sir. My best trousers, too. Yes, sir. Please, sir. We must pay the passengers for their spoiled clothes, and my trousers are ruined. I hope this will teach you not to play tricks with the coaches.
It's a huge difference when you look at both versions back to back. But I gotta say, I prefer the original version of that conversation a lot more, because Michael Angelis really does play it off well. You can really tell how pissed off the Fat Controller is in this moment. In conclusion, The Scarf for Percy, I feel, is a good way to start off the third series, taking a relatively short story from the Railway series and making it even better than the original, giving a little more plot to it, and a lot more humour to it as well, as Thomas the Tank Engine can provide. This is an episode that's definitely worth checking out at this time of year, especially if you're feeling cold and want to wrap up warm. Just don't be tempted to wear trousers as a scarf. You'll look silly. Percy's Promise is the second episode of the third series, and based off of the story of the same name from the Railway series book, Percy the Small Engine. This is an episode that was originally planned to be part of the second series of the show, but was pushed to the third. And I'll go through my theory on why this was after I read through the story. Every summer, Sodor is busy with holidaymakers visiting the island to see the sights. One morning, Thomas is running along the coastal branch line taking children to the beach. When he reaches the station at the port, he meets Percy, who is bringing stone trucks to the harbour. Percy greets Thomas and remarks that he wishes he could take children, to which Thomas states that the children he has taken are the Vicar's Sunday School. He will also be busy in the evening, but offers him to let Percy take the children back home, which he gladly promises to do. At Dryall, Percy meets Harold, who warns him of bad weather coming and says to take care. He is also warned by Edward at the junction station to be careful of an oncoming storm, but Percy knows that he must keep his promise. The children enjoy a fun day at the beach until tea time, at which the weather turns bad and begins raining hard. Percy returns to the port station, where Annie and Clarabel are waiting for him to take the children home. Percy is most uncomfortable with the rain, but despite his longing to be at the sheds, he manages to get on with it. As Percy begins his return journey, he leaves the coastal village and enters the countryside. Percy struggles to see through the beating rain, but worse is to come. The tracks ahead have been flooded and Percy winds up in the middle of the floodwaters. His fire is dampened as the water floods into his cab. His crew then tries to find some dry firewood, and his fireman asks the guard for some floorboards from his van. The guard grumbles since he had only swept the floor earlier that morning, but still agrees to help. Percy's fire is soon burning well and he feels more comfortable again, until he sees Harold approaching and worries that he wants to laugh at him. A crate attached to a parachute is dropped out and thuds on top of Percy's boiler, to his annoyance. His driver explains Harold bought hot drinks for the crew and passengers. Percy then thanks Harold before the helicopter flies away. Percy bravely continues on with his journey, and though he begins losing steam again, he keeps going. He finally reaches tracks clear of the flood and triumphantly brings the train to Elsbridge. Thomas is waiting for him and congratulates him for keeping his promise. The Fat Controller arrives aboard Harold and thanks Percy and his crew. The Fat Controller is greatly impressed with Percy's efforts and praises him for being a really useful engine. As I mentioned, this episode was originally planned to be in the second series, but was pushed back to the third series. I assume this decision was made because the team probably would have found it hard to put an engine deep in water without badly damaging the model, since they were still learning how to use the models at the time and how to do stuff without permanently damaging their models and replacing them, which would have cost a lot of money. But since David Mitton had worked on tugs prior to this series, it gave him a lot more experience with the models and how to get them into water without badly damaging them. And we all know that this episode brings up a continuity error since Percy talks about it in Percy Takes the Plunge in the second series. But you could make the argument that this is probably a flashback episode that takes place during Series 2. But whatever way you want to look at it, you can't deny that this is a great episode for the TV series. It really pushes the boundaries of what the team could do with their models at the time. Making actual range show up at the model sets is just astounding. It looked astounding back then and it still looks astounding today. In the original story and the first script of the episode, the floorboards actually came from Cloudbell. A non-sentient brake van was added in the final adaptation to avoid the implication that the guard was using an axe on a sentient coach, because, you know, it's a kid show. And I find it hilarious the way the guard grumbles about having to take some of the floorboards out in his brake van.
Percy's driver and fireman had to find some more firewood. "I'll have some of your floorboards, please," said the fireman to the guard. "I only swept the floor this morning," grumbled the guard. But he still helped.
What a great guy. This episode also sees improvements to Howard the Helicopter's model, since he had two sets of blades in the second series. One set for when he was stationary and when he was about to take off, and another set of blades that are just circles spinning around when he's flying. But here he just has the one set of propellers that's used for when he's stationary and when he's flying. That's a big improvement from the previous model of Harold. And the bad weather music in this episode is just phenomenal. Michael Donnell and Junior Campbell once again upped their game for this episode. And over the years it's become one of the most iconic themes in the TV series, being recreated several times by YouTube users. It's just another one of those episodes that pops into people's minds first whenever they talk about the TV series and the franchise as a whole. Percy's Promise is another one of those episodes that's a real highlight for the series. It has a great atmosphere to it, a great dilemma for Percy to go through, and it really does prove Percy's theory from the second series that water is nothing to an engine with determination. It's an episode that's sure to cheer you up if you're having a bad weather day. So check it out if you haven't seen it for a while, and you'll get a lot of enjoyment and thrills out of it. The third episode of the third series, Time for Trouble, is based off of the story Doubleheader from the Railway series book, The 8 Famous Engines. This is another one of those episodes that was originally planned for the second series, picking up following the events of Gordon Goes Foreign, another cancelled episode. But they decided to push it further to this series. We've had a whole series to wait for this adaptation of the story, so how does it work? It is a very busy time for the Fat Controller's engines, as the island of Sodor has a lot of visitors. The Fat Controller schedules more trains to cope with the demand, with Gordon in particular having to make more journeys than usual. Gordon is eager to ensure all of his trains are on time and works harder than ever to make sure this happens. Things are so hectic that at times Gordon has no sooner dropped off one load of passengers that he has to take another. Gordon doesn't mind this, however, and does his increased workload without fuss. Despite this, the Fat Controller soon decides that Gordon deserves a rest and James will take the express instead. James is delighted at the chance to show off and be as fast as Gordon. One day in the yard, James boasts to Toby about how important he is and how he is never late. The Fat Controller arrives and tells Toby that it is time for him to go to the works to have his worn parts replaced. Toby is upset at having to go for repairs and asks if Henrietta could come with him, but the Fat Controller states that he needs all coaches to be available. Percy promises to look after Henrietta while Toby's gone. Toby pumps the way to the works on the main line, but he starts making some clanking sounds. Since he has a smaller water tank than most other engines, he soon feels thirsty. He is glad when he starts to approach Lower Timoth and stops to take on water, as he and his driver do not think it will be a problem. However, the Cinnamon, who is new to the job, has never met Toby and orders them to continue on and clear the line for James and the Express. Toby sadly leaves and struggles to Knapford to replenish, but runs out of steam and is left stranded on the main line. Toby's fireman knows that they have to warn James about the blockage on the line, and Percy comes up with Henrietta. Although she hates leaving Toby stranded, Percy cheers her up by saying that she is helping Toby by carrying the fireman to warn James. The fireman reaches the station in time and tells James's crew what has happened. The Cinnamon apologises for causing the trouble while James is angry, knowing this will make him late, and he fumes when his driver tells him that he will need to push Toby as well as pull the express. James finds Toby and gives him a bump before starting to push him along.
Get on, you!
James works harder than ever, having to push and pull his train at the same time, and by the time he reaches Knapford he is exhausted. Some children on the platform see this, and one boy jokes as the express is late and James is tired. It must mean that he could not pull the express alone and needed Toby's help. Toby assures James that the children only tease him, but James does not find it amusing at all and sarcastically laughs as he vanishes in a cloud of steam, while Toby just smiles. As I said, the episode was meant to be adapted for the second series as well as Gordon Goes Foreign. But since Gordon Goes Foreign was cancelled and never put into production due to budget constraints, they had to improvise and come up with a new reason for Gordon needing a rest from those express works, rather than just going to London. And having several visitors and scheduling more trains for Gordon to pull is a really good reason for him to need a rest and James to replace him. And it makes sense to have James do the express routes for this time, since he's pulled the express before, and he was given the opportunity to pull the express sometimes to give Gordon a rest back in Series 1. This is another one of those episodes I enjoyed rewatching as a kid because I love Gordon's opening scene, how grand and special he looks while pulling the express. And I also love seeing James being his same old egotistical self, boasting to Toby about how important he feels he is, only to have it be thrown back in his face by the end of the story. It's also a really nice change of pace to have an episode focused on Toby for a while, since we haven't had a Toby story for a while now. And I assume that the small water tank thing Toby has must have been a huge thing, and must have been a norm for tram engines at the time. I don't know for certain because I never really read on the history of tram engines, but it must have been a thing back then since Wilbur Awdry wrote it in his original story. And it's also worth pointing out that in the original UK dub, the additional line of James saying,
"Look at me, I'm the smartest, most useful engine on the line,"
is reused in a later episode. But we'll get to that episode when we get to that episode. And I adore the voice that Michael Angelis gave James in the third series. He gives him this loud Scouse accent that really does suit the character really well. And he does a great job of showing it in the early narration of this episode and the other episodes that were on the VHS tapes.
"You know, little Toby," he boasted, "I'm an important engine, everyone knows it. I'm as regular as clockwork, never late, always on time." "Says you," replied Toby. James was fuming when he heard the news. "I'm going to be late." "Now, James," said his driver, "you'll have to push Toby." "What, me? Me push Toby and pull my train too? Get on, you!"
And it's worth pointing out that in the later narrations of the episodes, he could be quite inconsistent with James's voice.
"You know, little Toby," he boasted, "I'm an important engine, everyone knows it. I'm as regular as clockwork, never late, always on time." "Says you." James was fuming when he heard the news. "I'm going to be late." "What, me? Me? Push Toby and pull my train too? Get on, you!"
But here, this is where his big Scouse accent really came through. And I love every second of it. Time for Trouble is another fun episode that doesn't have any crash scenes or runaways or chase scenes. It's just a fun episode where stuff happens. And it's a nice way to have Toby have the spotlight again. It's another episode that I highly recommend checking out if you haven't seen it for a while. You'll get a nice little story with Toby, and it's great to see James being his usual egotistical self. It's definitely worth a watch. Gordon and the Famous Visitor is the 4th episode of the 3rd series, based on the story Domeless Engines from the Railway series book, Duck and the Diesel Engine. This is another one of those episodes that I rewatched a lot when I was a kid, watching the VHS tape. And I'll go into the details of why after I go through the story real quick. It is an important day at the yard as a special visitor named City of Truro has arrived and is now the centre of attention, with many people taking photographs and making notes. Duck explains to Thomas and Percy that the City of Truro is a celebrity, a very famous engine, and they will have the chance to talk to him later. Thomas, however, believes that City of Truro is too famous to want to talk to them. Most of the engines are very pleased about the visitor, but Gordon thinks that it's a lot of fuss about nothing. The other engines are happy to find that the City of Truro is quite friendly and he enjoys talking to them well into the night. Early the next morning, City of Truro heads back to his own railway, and Thomas tells Gordon that the engine is famous since he was the first to go over 100 miles an hour. Gordon tells Thomas that City of Truro has no dome and that domeless engines are not trustworthy or have no respect as far as he is concerned. He also claims that 100 miles an hour would be easy for him to achieve. Later that day, Duck is taking some trucks to Wellsworth and tells Edward what Gordon said about the visitor. Edward tells Duck to take no notice of Gordon and assures him that he's just jealous because he thinks that no engine should be famous besides him. Moments later, Gordon thunders past the two engines on the main line with his wheels pounding the rails, and he disappears through the station, determined to go as fast as the visitor. Duck watches and jokingly tells Edward that Gordon will knock himself to bits. Further along the line, Gordon begins to feel something loose at the top of his boiler. He decides to slow down, but it's already too late. He meets a teasing wind which blows in very hard puffs on the viaduct. Not a gentle or hard steady one. The wind creeps under Gordon's loose dome, lifts it off and sends it flying away into the valley below. Without Gordon's dome, he is most uncomfortable with the wind whistling through the hole where it should be and feels silly and embarrassed without it. And to make matters worse for him, the trucks laugh at him when he reaches Knapford. He tries to shoo them away by wishing steam at them, but nothing he does works as they crowd around him. On the journey home, Gordon wants his driver to find his dome. However, he says that it is too late to find it now and Gordon will have to go to the works for a new one. Gordon is most upset and hopes that the sheds are going to be empty tonight when he gets home, but all the engines are there waiting for him. As Gordon turns around on the turntable, he hears a voice saying,
"Never trust domeless engines, they aren't respectable."
This episode marks the first time a real-life engine appears in the TV series, that being the famous City of Truro. Built in 1903 for the Great Western Railway at Swindon Works, to a design by George Jackson Churchward. Truro is one of the most famous locomotives in the world, as well as being the most famous for the GWR. And City of Truro must have had a huge impact on the crew of the Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends production, especially in the hit era, since he popped up occasionally in the hit era and the CGI era, in picture and book form. That just shows how much each production team who worked on the show really loved City of Truro as an engine.
Ha! Who cares? A lot of fuss about nothing if you ask me.
Yeah, no one's asking you though, are they?
And having Gordon be jealous of him really does make sense for this episode, and for railway continuity in general, especially with this exchange between him and Thomas about Truro.
Good riddance, he grumbled. Chattering all night. Who is he anyway? Doc told you, replied Thomas. He's famous. As famous as me? Nonsense. He's famouser than you. He went 100 miles an hour before you were even thought of. So he says. Off Gordon.
Now this actually makes sense for Gordon to be the one to question City of Truro's record-breaking attempt, since he's based on the same type of locomotive the Flying Scotsman is. Since City of Truro is believed to have broken the 100 mile an hour speed barrier for steam railways in 1904, the year after it was introduced, while the Flying Scotsman was officially recorded reaching 100 miles an hour on the 30th of November 1934. And it made sense at the time for them to use this argument in the Railway series, and as well as the episode, because this debate has been going on ever since Flying Scotsman broke the record, with some railway fanatics believing that the City of Truro did it first, and other railway fanatics believing that the Flying Scotsman did it first because her record attempt was officially recorded. And there's three sides to the argument. Those that believe that Truro did it first, those that believe the Flying Scotsman did it first, and then there's those like myself who don't really care for the argument and just accepts the fact that both engines achieved the record. Now I've watched quite a few railway documentaries about Great British locomotives when I was a kid, and a number of them talked about the City of Truro's 100 mile an hour record breaking attempt, and the Flying Scotsman's one as well. So I'm one of those types of people who accepts that both engines broke the world speed record for steam and reached 100 miles an hour, with the City of Truro being the first one to do it, and the Flying Scotsman to be the first one to be officially recorded doing it. And since Gordon is based off of the Flying Scotsman's class, it made sense for him to be the one to be jealous of City of Truro. It just plays on the real-life rivalry between the GWR and the LNER.
I never boast, but I'd say 100 miles an hour would be easy for me.
And when you look at it from a certain point of view, this episode introduces another form of racism for the island of Sodor. The first official one was the rivalry between the steam engines and the diesel engines, and this one shows Gordon being prejudiced against engines that don't have domes, like Truro.
I didn't like his looks. He's got no dome. Never trust domeless engines, they're not respectable.
We all know that it's not right by any means to promote racism or bias, whatever your ethnic backgrounds, but the thing about domeless engines is played more for Gordon's jealousy of anything else. And it's a little nod to the rivalry between the Big Four back in the days. And I love how it's further implied by Edward's exchange with Duck at the station.
Take no notice, soothed Edward. He's just jealous. He thinks no engine should be famous but him.
That little bit of dialogue is just very fitting for Gordon, since he feels himself to be the most important engine on the island. So of course he'd feel jealous of another famous engine being around, since he feels he's the only famous engine that matters. This is another episode that I used to rewatch a lot as a kid on the VHS tapes, because I found it one of the most entertaining episodes for me since it was Gordon-centered. And Gordon has always been one of my favourite characters in the TV series. I used to have an Ertl model of Gordon that I used to take everywhere with me. And it's another one of those episodes I used to recreate endlessly with my Ertl models and wooden railway models. It's another fun episode where Gordon gets boastful and gets his comeuppance afterwards. It's further proof that karma is a real bitch. And the scene of Gordon losing his dome and getting laughed at by the trucks gets me every time. It's just another one of those funny moments where you get to hear the truck's funny monkey giggle. And I'm a huge sucker for the Troublesome Trucks' classic series laugh. As I've said last year, it always sounded like giggling monkeys to me, just because of the high-pitched voices. I also love the brand new version of Gordon's theme that was introduced in this episode. Sounding pretty much like the original theme was in Series 1 and 2, but making it sound more grander with the new instruments they were able to use this year. It's just a huge improvement from the previous version of the theme, getting to use more instruments than what they had back in the 80s, and making it sound grander and epic. And it's more proof of Michael O'Donnell and Junior Campbell upping their game in the music department. And I suppose it's pointless to talk about this episode without bringing up a continuity error. The fact that Devious Diesel is at the sheds when everyone's admiring City of Truro at the beginning. Now in continuity this doesn't make sense because Diesel was sent packing back in Series 2. So why would he be allowed to come back to the island all of a sudden during City of Truro's visit? Although I guess you could make the argument that it was probably just another shunter Diesel of the same class who came with City of Truro to the island. Because I've ridden on a lot of steam locomotives on the mainland, including the Flying Scotsman, and they've often had a Diesel helping them at the back of the trains. So since Diesel's just one in a long line of Diesel shunter classes, you could make the argument that there's probably another shunter Diesel that looks exactly like Diesel but is not Diesel. But if you look at it as just Devious Diesel, it is a continuity error. Gordon and the Famous Visitor is another one of those episodes that I rewatch countless times whenever I put it on the DVD. It's always been one of my favourite episodes because of how entertaining and funny it is. It's one that I definitely recommend rewatching if you haven't seen it for a good long time. You'll have a fun time seeing Gordon trying to be the centre of attention again. It's a nice little nod to the rivalry between the GWR and the LNER, and it's just an all-around funny episode. It's definitely worth a watch. Donald's Duck is the 5th episode of the 3rd series, based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book Oliver the Western Engine. This episode stands out for most fans of the TV series because it's another Duck-centered episode. And as I've mentioned, Duck is one of the most popular characters in the TV series. But is the story as popular as the character himself? Let's take a look. Duck the Great Western Engine works very hard on the island of Sodor. Whether he is pulling coaches, taking trucks or shunting in the yard, he always does the work quickly and without complaint. One day, the Fat Controller comes to see Duck to thank him for his hard work in the yard, then asks him if he would like to have a branch line of his own, which Duck happily accepts. Taking charge of his new line, Duck is happy at being given such a big responsibility. He finds it to be quite scenic, running along the coast and into a port where ships dock. Duck very much enjoys exploring the new line as well as being close to the sea, remarking that it's just like being on holiday, and is soon busier than ever. The Fat Controller is building a shed at Timberport, and Duck helps out with the construction along with the other engines while his passengers are looked after by Bertie. Although it is a long job, everyone helping means that the shed will be finished on time. Duck is still feeling the importance of his new responsibility and enjoys talking endlessly about them. One night in the shed, he starts telling Donald the Scottish engine how important he is to the line now. Donald is sleepy, but when Duck carries on, Donald, at the end of his tether, mocks him by making quacking noises and saying that Duck sounds like he laid an egg. Duck is offended by this joke and tells his crew about it the next day. Duck's fireman has a plan to pay back Donald and tells Duck and the driver. They all agree, but soon Duck is back at work and nothing else is said, not even a quack. That night, however, when Donald goes to sleep, Duck's crew drops something into the Scottish engine's water tank. The next morning when Donald stops for water, his crew are astounded when a white duckling pops out of his water tank. Donald sees the funny side of the joke, and the duckling is friendly towards him and his crew and is allowed to ride on his tender despite the other engines often teasing him about her. The duckling soon tires of travelling and hops off at a station, which is where she ends up staying. That night, Donald's crew decides to pay Duck back, and the next morning, the driver and fireman find an egg in a nest box under the Great Western Engine's bunker. Donald jokes that Duck must have laid it in the night, and Duck agrees that Donald has won. The duckling enjoys swimming and playing in a pond near her station where she can see the engines going past. The station master calls her Dilly, but to everyone else she will always be Donald's duck. This is another one of those iconic episodes that everybody looks back on and remembers fondly when they talk about the TV series as well as the railway series. And with good reason. And Duck the Great Western Engine gets another big time in the spotlight in this episode, being given his own branch line after having done so much hard work in the yard. And I absolutely love the scenery of his branch line, all these coastal lines and being near a beach. It just takes me back to my childhood days of going to Devon beaches in the summer. It just has that big connection with me. And I absolutely love the banter between Duck and Donald in this episode, especially in the night where Donald makes remarks about him sounding like a duck quacking. And I'm just going to say I like both versions of Michael Angelis' narration for this scene. Both are equally as funny as each other, especially how he makes Donald sound quite funnily high-pitched at times.
You don't understand, Donald, how much the Fat Controller relies on me. "Och, aye," muttered Donald sleepily. "I'm Great Western, and I quack, quack, quack." "What?" "You heard quack, quack, you go. Sounds like you'd an egg laid. Now wheesh and let an engine sleep." "Quack yourself," said Duck indignantly. "You don't understand, Donald, how much the Fat Controller relies on me." "Och, aye," muttered Donald sleepily. "I'm Great Western, and I quack, quack, quack." "What?" "Ye heard quack, quack, you go. Sounds like you'd an egg laid. Now wheesh and let an engine sleep." "Quack yourself," said Duck indignantly.
It's just one of those funny moments that stands out to me a lot. And I'm just going to come out and say it right now. That little duckling is fecking adorable. The second you see it on screen, it just looks so cute. I assume it's because it takes me back to my childhood of feeding ducks at Chew Valley Lake, since my parents would take me and my brother up there quite a number of times in the summer, and we'd take lots of bread slices along just to feed the ducks. It just brings me back to simple childhood days. And the episode was so popular that years later Michael Donnell and Junior Campbell would make a sing-along song about the duck. The episode has just had that much of an impact with the fans and the creators as well. Donald's Duck is a fun episode that takes me back to my childhood days of summers on the beaches, and it's just fun and adorable to see the duckling with Donald. It's another episode that I recommend checking out if you love the seaside and ducks in general. It's another great Duck the Great Western Engine episode that gives him and Donald some spotlight, and it's one of the few episodes where you see one of the Scottish twins rather than both of them take up the same story. So if you haven't seen this episode for a while, definitely go check it out and see what you've been missing out on. It's a fun little story with a cute little duckling and a sense of being on a summer holiday when you see the beaches and the coastal lines of Duck's branch line. It's definitely worth checking out. Now we're going into non-Audrey territory, folks, with Thomas Gets Bumped, the 6th episode of the 3rd series, based on the magazine stories Hello Thomas and A Bump on the Line written by Andrew Brenner. As I said, this was the first episode of the series to not be based off of a story from Wilbert Audrey or Christopher Audrey, but it was based on 2 magazine stories by Andrew Brenner, the future showrunner of Thomas, and Brittlecroft and David Mitton decided to adapt this story since it seemed like a Thomas the Tank Engine story to them. But is it worthy of being part of the Thomas franchise? Let's dive into the story. Every afternoon, Thomas puffs along his branch line with Annie and Clarabelle. First they pass the watermill, then come to a big farm and see a village nestled on either side of it. Whenever children hear Thomas coming, they stand on the bridge to wave at him until he's out of sight. One day, Thomas is waiting at a signal to talk to some children. Percy is waiting too and teases Thomas that if he is late, the Fat Controller will substitute him. Thomas scoffs at Percy but is secretly concerned. The next day, Thomas sees an inspector waving a red flag as he approaches the station. He sees some children waving at him on the bridge too, and he becomes concerned as it is a good station. The children ask Thomas to take them home, and the station master explains to the driver that the school bus broke down. The children climb aboard Annie and Clarabelle, and Thomas takes them to the next station where Bertie has waited to take them home. When Thomas finishes his job, he is very late and worries that the Fat Controller will be cross with him, which Percy knew would happen and tells James he warned Thomas. The next morning, Thomas is relieved that the Fat Controller is nowhere to be seen at the station.
Thank goodness, sighed Thomas.
But his fears worsen when the rails on his branch line buckle from the hot temperature. He tries to stop in time, but it's too late and he derails on the buckled tracks. Thomas is concerned for his passengers, but his driver assures him that they will be looked after. Later, he is sent to shunt trucks in the yard while the workmen repair the line. Bertie the bus takes Thomas's passengers for him, but makes more stops to let people off closer to their homes. And Thomas worries that he's lost his passengers and that Bertie will replace him. However, after the line is repaired, the Fat Controller announces to Thomas that his timetable will be changed so that he and Bertie can work together more often. To Thomas's relief, the passengers say that while Bertie is a nice buzz, they miss Thomas and are glad to see him back. And he thanks Bertie for taking care of them while his line was being repaired. Bertie prefers that while he likes making new friends, he likes sharing them with him. Thomas then tells Bertie that he is a good friend. This episode marks the first time that an episode would be based off of a magazine story from Andrew Brenner, who, as I said, would go on to serve as head writer of the series beginning in 2013, Kin of the Railway. And one thing I recently found out after doing research for this episode was the fact that Andrew Brenner later publicly expressed annoyance during an interview with SIF that his stories were being used without his consent or credit. And having rewatched the episodes myself back then and not seeing his name in any of the credits, I can understand. I mean, you'd be pretty pissed off as well if your stories were used without consent and they wouldn't give you credit for it. But even though it was used without his consent or credit, it is a really good episode. I honestly don't remember reading any of those magazine stories, which is funny because I used to buy the Thomas magazines when I was a kid. But this episode really is a good mashup of both those stories. And the whole buckled railway storyline thing would be reused in series 20. But that episode was done different enough so that it wouldn't be a copy and paste of this episode. And this is another episode that I really enjoyed when I was a kid. It's very clear that Andrew Brenner loved the franchise so much, and he did research into railways when he wrote those stories, since railway lines can buckle and bend when they're exposed to heat. This happens quite a lot on railways. The lines get so hot that they buckle and bend under the heat wave, and then they have to be replaced so that engines don't crash. Whether or not you knew that this episode was based on an Audrey story or not, it's still a really good episode, and it does feel like something that would have come from the Railway series, in my opinion. And it's good that we see Bertie the Bus getting some spotlight once again. Of course, he doesn't appear as much as Thomas or any of the other characters do, But it's still a nice spotlight episode for him, and it's a good reminder that while the two are frenemies, they still get along really well most of the time, and they're happy to put their differences aside and help out when the passengers are in need.
Thank you for looking after my passengers. That's all right, Thomas. I like to make new friends, but I'm glad to share them with you. You're a good friend indeed, replied Thomas, and always will be.
Thomas Gets Bumped is one of those episodes where there's no runaways, no chase scenes, no huge crashes, except for the crash that Thomas does. It's just another one of those days in the life of Thomas's branch line episodes that we often need for the TV series. As I've mentioned a number of times before, Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends didn't always need a big spectacular episode where something exciting, exhilarating and threatening happened. Sometimes they just needed a simple episode that's just a slice of life. That's part of what makes this TV series so enjoyable back then. Thomas Gets Bumped is another one of those episodes that I really look forward to watching whenever I put it on DVD, and it's an episode that I do recommend checking out if you haven't seen it for a while. You'll enjoy watching this adaptation of one of Andrew Brenner's stories, and it's just a nice slice of life episode that we often need for the TV series. It's definitely worth watching. Here's one of the big ones, guys. Thomas, Percy and the Dragon, the 7th episode of the 3rd series based on the magazine stories Percy's Night Out and Percy and the Dragon written by Andrew Brenner. This is a Thomas episode that's become very iconic over the years, and I'll explain why once I go through the story. Percy is still ribbing Thomas about the time he thought Percy was a ghost. At first Thomas pretends that he knew it was just a trick the whole time. When that doesn't work and Percy jokes about him being afraid of the dark, Thomas simply goes to sleep. The next morning, Thomas is asked by the Fat Controller to collect a special load from Brendam Harbour. Thomas wonders what it is, but the Fat Controller tells him to wait and see. Meanwhile, Percy is stuck in a siding while shunting at Lower Sudbury and has to stay there for the night due to the jammed points while waiting for Henry to pass by with a goods train. His driver and fireman go home for tea, and Percy watches the other engines heading back to Tidmouth Sheds. The misty night comes and Percy starts feeling lonely in the siding. He gets scared when he hears a shrieking noise, not knowing that it's only an owl, and wishes Thomas was with him. When Thomas is waiting for his load at the harbour, he is horrified to find it's a dragon, but his driver tells him it's a paper one and needed for a carnival. Workmen put lights on the dragon for Thomas to travel safely, and he sets off into the mist for the carnival. Percy is asleep until Thomas passes by with the dragon, which terrifies Percy to the point where he refuses to open his eyes until his driver returns. The next day, the points are mended and Percy tries to tell Gordon about what he had seen. Unfortunately, the big blue engine thinks Percy has been in the sun too long and puffs away with the express. This soon leads to other engines teasing him about it.
Look out, Percy, chuckled James, or the dragon may gobble you up. Piss off.
He begins to think he might have imagined the dragon, but later sees it again and is indignant when he sees Thomas pushing it. Thomas explains what happened and the two make up for their teasing. This is an episode that really stands out to Thomas the Tank Engine fans. I think the main factor of it is because of the Chinese dragon. I mean, when you look at that thing, it just looks so amazing and gorgeous and so colourful. They really did capture the feel of what a Chinese dragon would look like in a Chinese carnival. And the dragon itself would be so popular that they would sell various toys based on it. It's even had the honour of going on a Day Out with Thomas event, being pulled by Thomas at one of the heritage lines, and it's even been put on display as part of Thomas Land in Japan. And it will pop up again in this series during the Hit era. It just shows that the Hit team really did love this model as well, and they wanted to show it again a couple of times. That just goes to show that even non-sentient things in Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends can make an impact and become iconic. And the Chinese dragon theme that Michael Angelis and Junior Campbell composed is just amazing. They really did capture the feel of what Chinese music would sound like. It's mixing in Chinese instruments with the classic Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends instruments. It's a clever mix of both. And if you look at it from another point of view, this episode seems to be like a long-awaited sequel to Ghost Train, since it mentions the events of Ghost Train, and it ends up having Thomas getting his own back at Percy without even trying to. Yeah, no joke. For all the teasing that Percy did about Thomas being afraid of his ghostly trick, Thomas actually gets back at Percy without even trying to. There's never a point in the episode where Thomas says, maybe I can use this dragon to get back at Percy for scaring the shit out of me earlier, and then teasing me about it. No, he never intended to pay Percy back for that ghostly trick, it just sort of happened without him even trying to. It's just funny how he got his own back at Percy without making an effort. And this little bit of dialogue gets me every time.
Said Percy's driver. I'm sorry, Percy, but you'll have to stay here for the night. Where are you going? Asked Percy. Home for tea, replied the fireman.
Well, you've got to get your priorities straight, haven't you? And the scenes at night time are really stunning like they always have been in the model series. Just the fog effects and the lighting is just so amazing. It really shows how talented the model makers were and the people on set were. And the first time I saw that owl in the episode, I just thought it looked so damn adorable. I mean, when you look at that fin, it just looks like one of the cutest fins you'd ever seen. Props to the model makers for making a simple owl look so adorable. Thomas, Percy and the Dragon is one of the most iconic episodes of the TV series, and many people remember it because of the music, the storyline, and the Chinese dragon. It's an episode that you could watch around Halloween time as a sequel to Ghost Train, but it's also an episode that could be watched any time of the year. Hell, you could even watch it on Chinese New Year if you wanted to. Whenever time you want to watch it, it's definitely worth your time. It's a fun episode with a stunning Chinese dragon model, and it's just entertaining all the way through.
Piss off!
Here's another personal favourite of mine, folks. The 8th episode of the 3rd series, Diesel Does It Again, based on the magazine stories Trouble in the Harbour Yard and Bumps written by Andrew Brenner. This episode sees the return of the first villain for the TV series, Devious Diesel, but is it as great as I remember it from when I was a kid? Let's steam down to the harbour and find out. Duck and Percy enjoy their work at the harbour yards moving trucks to and from the quay, but the engines feel very exhausted one morning because the harbour is becoming busier than ever. The Fat Controller understands this and promises that another engine will come to help out. Percy and Duck are very glad to hear this and wait, but their relief turns to shock when the engine sent to help turns out to be Diesel. The two engines asked him what he is doing at the harbour, to which Diesel tells them that he was called back by the Fat Controller and to shunt some dreadfully tiresome trucks. To make himself clear, he bumps some trucks hard. Percy and Duck do not trust Diesel and refuse to work with him, not leaving their shed. The Fat Controller is in his office enjoying his iced bun and tea when he gets a call on the telephone from the harbour master saying that there is trouble in the harbour yard. Diesel is working alone, and as a result, the work starts to pile up as the cargo and passengers are delayed on the quay. People soon start complaining about the railway. The Fat Controller arrives and demands an explanation from Percy and Duck, and they explain that they will not work with Diesel. Duck adds that he thought Diesel was sent packing after the lies he told. The Fat Controller tells the two that he has to give Diesel a second chance as he was the only engine available and is trying to help Percy and Duck out by bringing him to the harbour, demanding that the two go back to work. Percy and Duck sadly do as they are told. Things are no better next morning. Diesel's driver did not put his brakes on properly the previous night and he bumps straight into Percy, frightening him and does not even apologise. Later, Diesel bumps some trucks so hard that the loads spill everywhere. Percy and Duck are worried as to what the Fat Controller will say, but they do not tell him after Diesel threatens to brand them as telltales if they do. Thinking he can get away with anything, Diesel becomes increasingly rude while he shunts some China clay trucks the next day. He accidentally shunts the trucks through a set of unsecure buffers, pushing them into the sea.
Fuck!
Although the harbour workers safely recover the trucks from the sea that night, the China clay is gone and the Fat Controller is furious with Diesel upon hearing the news. He tells Diesel that he will be expelled from the harbour before telling Duck and Percy that they will have to handle the work by themselves again. Knowing that extra work is preferable to working with Diesel, Percy and Duck gladly go back to work as Diesel slinks slowly away in disgrace. As I said, this episode marks the return of Devious Diesel, a character that we hadn't seen since Series 2's Duck and the Diesel trilogy, unless you count his cameos that came afterwards, but this was his first massive return in the TV series as he got another big role this time around. But in this episode he isn't his devious self like he was back in Series 2. He shows off his bullying side that would become a staple for the CGI series. And I love how Michael Angelis carries on with the oily voice that Sir Ringo Starr gave him back in Series 2. Of course he doesn't sound exactly like Sir Ringo, but I think he captures the oiliness down to treat. Every time you hear Michael say his Diesel lines, you could tell how much of a blast he's having just using that voice and saying these lines.
Good morning, your worthy fat Sir Topham Hatt sent me. I hope you are pleased to see me again. I am to shunt some dreadfully tiresome trucks. Shunt where? Said Percy suspiciously. Where? Why, from here to there, purred Diesel, and then again from there to here. Easy, isn't it? Wake up there, Percy. You have work to do.
And while my favourite narration for this episode is the early version compared to the redub version, I have to say I do like a little bit from the redub version. It's mostly the bit where Diesel bumps the trucks hard and they scream and Diesel growls. I just really do enjoy both versions for their own reasons. I love how in the early narration the truck scream sounds more comical.
Diesel, as if to make himself quite clear, bumps some trucks hard. Oh! Scream the trucks. Grrr, growled Diesel.
And in the redone version, Michael does a slightly more serious but still slightly comical version.
Diesel, as if to make himself quite clear, bumps some trucks hard. Oh! Scream the trucks. Grrr, growled Diesel.
And Diesel's bullying in this episode actually plays to real life. Some children at school and even people in workplaces would often get bullied by nasty people, and they often get threatened not to tell anyone unless they want to be tattletales, telltales, or have something even worse happen to them.
Later, Diesel bumped the truck so hard that the loads went everywhere. What will the Fat Controller say? Gasped Percy. He won't like it, said Duck. And who's going to tell him, I wonder? Said Diesel. Two little goody-goody telltales like you, I suppose. Percy and Duck did not want to be telltales, so they said nothing.
This episode teaches us that going forward with your bully problems is the best way forward rather than saying nothing. And it shows that the bullies will always get their comeuppance at the end of the day. And it made sense for Duck and Percy to be the main characters to deal with Diesel in this episode. Duck because of the rivalry in the Duck and the Diesel saga back in Series 2. And it made sense with Percy because Duck's a good friend to Percy, since he's the one who showed him how to stand up for himself back in Duck Takes Charge. And even though Percy never interacted with Diesel properly back in Series 2, the fact that he's a good friend to Duck would make sense that he would take his side over Diesel's return. It just shows how close the two are as friends, and it reminds us on how Diesel left a bad name for himself and other Diesels back when he first visited the island, making the steam engine suspicious of any diesel engines who come to the island. Just shows how much of a mark Diesel made on his first visit. Another reason I love this episode so much is because of how funny it is. All those funny moments that appear throughout the episodes. Diesel bumping the trucks so hard, Diesel bumping into Percy, Diesel pushing the trucks into the waters. There's just so many funny moments in this episode that makes it rewatchable. I also love how Diesel takes his anger out on the trucks by bumping them really, really hard. And that honestly makes sense because it gives you the notion that Diesel still holds a grudge against the trucks for singing that insulting song about him on his first visit. It just shows that Diesel's the kind of character that still holds grudges, even though he's never exactly mean to Duck throughout the episode aside from just calling him a telltale. It's almost like he's kind of forgiven Duck for what happened back in Pop Goes the Diesel, but is still seriously angry towards the trucks. I mean, all Duck did was not tell him that he was trying to take the Von trucks from the siding, and the trucks just made fun of him by singing an insulting song. So it seems like Diesel's a lot more angry with the trucks than he was with Duck this time around. And the episode was so popular that the CGI series recreated the scene of Diesel pushing the trucks into the water for the episode Diesel's Ghostly Christmas. And the events were also mentioned by Salted Dockyard Diesel. It just shows that this is another one of those episodes that had such an impact with the writing staff. And it's worth pointing out that we get to see some tugs models in this episode. One being the SS Vienna in the background, and Big Mickey working in the background in front of SS Vienna. And from this point onwards, Big Mickey will become a staple for the TV series, popping up at the docks every time there's an episode based on the docks, and eventually getting a personality in Series 21. Overall, Diesel Does It Again is still as great as I remember it to be. It's got a lot of funny moments, it's enjoyable to watch Diesel being his old self again, and it's just an all-around fun episode for everybody to watch who loves the TV series. It's an episode that's definitely worth checking out if you love Devious Diesel, Duck the Great Western Engine, and funny moments that the TV series is well known for.
Fuck.
Here's another one of the big uns, folks. Henry's Forest, the 9th episode of the 3rd series based on the magazine stories Clearing Up and the story of the same name written by Andrew Brenner. This is another one of those episodes that gets talked about a lot among the Thomas community, being one of the most iconic episodes and for having some controversy with the Audrey family. But I'll get into that once I go through the plot. Henry has lived on the island of Sodor for many years and would not want to live anywhere else. He likes every part of it, from the flowery fields to the beaches with white sand. But there is one place that he enjoys visiting more than any other: the forest. Henry remembers the day long ago when he and Toby bought some new trees to be planted and Terence and Trevor helped ball them into place. One night, everything changes as a summer storm rages across the island. All the engines are in the sheds talking about the wind blowing outside, except for Henry, who hopes that it will not harm the forest. By morning, the winds have gone, but severe damage has been done to the forest. Henry is sent to help Donald clear the line of trees. The big green engine feels very devastated by all the damage done in his forest and now wonders what will happen to all the animals that live there. Henry's trucks are loaded with logs to be taken to the timber mill, where they will be recycled to become furniture and other things. While Henry is pleased that the wood is being put to good use, he is still sad to lose a section of the place that meant so much to him. Thomas and Toby feel sorry for Henry and wish that there is something they could do to make things better again. Later at the yards, Toby meets the Fat Controller, who notices that the tram engine looks glum. Toby tells him that he and Henry are very sad about the trees, explaining that the forest was a special place to Henry and now whatever is left has been destroyed. The Fat Controller tells Toby that he will soon put things right and sends him to collect some trucks, loaded with small trees all ready to be planted. When Henry returns to the forest, he is surprised to see Terence and Trevor busily helping workmen to plant the trees. Terence tells Henry that they are beginning again and that the hillside will look better than ever before. Now when Henry stops by his forest, not only can he see the new trees growing strong and tall, but the animals are returning to their home. Whatever sounds these woods bring, he is always happy to be here. It's pretty pointless to talk about this episode without bringing up the controversy, mostly with the Audrey family. Wilbert Audrey is known for criticising this episode for his lack of realism. The major flaws he found were Henry's driver letting him stop in the forest without alerting the signalman, also known as Rule 55, paving the way for a severe crash with an unaware locomotive and the number of trees so close to the line that could catch fire from a spark from an engine's funnel. Britt Allcroft, who adapted the episode along with David Mitton, countered the second flaw by claiming that they had seen many other railways that do the same thing. Despite Allcroft countering what Audrey had said, his criticism may have inspired Henry's statement in the 5th series episode James and the Trouble with Trees, about the Fat Controller having trees too close to the line removed for fear that they might cause trouble. But despite the controversy and criticism from Audrey, this is a really beautiful episode. I mean, just look at the forest, it just looks so gorgeous, especially if you're a fan of nature. You can really see how much work went into making this set. Just all those trees and animals that show up on the railway. And it's quite a devastating episode as well, mainly with the storm destroying the majority of the forest. It just makes you feel really sad for Henry when he feels really sad about the forest losing a bit of it. It also adds a new layer to Henry's character. Before this, he was shown as a rather kind engine who had a bit of a bad side to him, mostly due to spending a lot of time with Gordon and James. But this episode shows that he has a softer side to him, a side that loves nature and appreciates the wonders of the forests. It's just a wonderful expansion of an already existing character, adding more layer and depth to him. And the music Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell composed for this episode is just so damn gorgeous. From the dark sounding music that occurs when the storm shows up, to the sad music that plays when we see the devastation of the storm. And to the gentle music at the end of the episode where we see Henry's forest grow back. I know I've said this a lot of times, but the two really have outdone themselves with this music for the episode. It's just some of the most charming music I've ever heard for the TV series thus far. It just fills you with so much emotions that you could just listen to it and feel calm and smooth while listening to it. It's just such a great track. And back when I was a kid, I didn't really think that much about it, but the sad music when Henry sees the devastation of the storm in his forest, it actually gets me a little teary-eyed these days. It just shows how powerful music can be in children's TV shows, as well as any other projects. It's just one of the many aspects of the show that I appreciate a lot more as an adult than I did as a kid. Something that I wouldn't have thought twice about as a kid, but absolutely love it as an adult. It just shows how powerful music can be in children's TV shows and any other forms of media, given the right composing team. Most children's TV shows at the time would often reuse the same tracks in each episode, but Michael Jr. went all the way to make special tracks for each episode, and some tracks would even be exclusive to some episodes. These two were composing geniuses. They didn't have to go all out with their music for a children's TV show, but I'm really glad that they did, especially for this episode. It just really shows how much talent the two had, and how they should have been hired to do other projects. Hell, I'd go so far as to say that they should be called to do some big screen projects. Their music is just so impactful at times. Henry's Forest is another one of those episodes that gets talked about a lot among the Thomas community, and with good reason. All those things I've listed makes this one of the best episodes that the TV series had to offer. It's one that I would definitely recommend checking out if you haven't seen it for a while. It's a wonderful story with a great environmental message that isn't shoved down the kids' throats. It makes kids enjoy the forest without shoving it in their faces, and it's definitely worth checking out if you haven't seen it for ages. You'll enjoy the beautiful atmosphere of the forest, the beautiful music Michael O'Donnell and Jr. Campbell composed, seeing a new side to Henry, and just the all-around gorgeousness of this episode. It's definitely one of the best episodes the show has to offer. The Trouble with Mud is the 10th episode of the third series, based on the story Leaves from the Railway series book, Gordon the Big Engine. This is going to get very repetitive, but this is another one of those episodes that I really loved as a kid. I just used to watch it endlessly on the VHS tape, and I still watch it pretty endlessly as an adult. One autumn morning, Thomas is being cleaned when Gordon arrives and is somehow covered in mud. Thomas tells Gordon to have a washdown, but Gordon does not care and leaves. A strong wind is blowing and Gordon's driver tells him to slow down, but that only makes Gordon more cross from it being dirty and late. In the goods yard at the next station, Gordon sees a sign saying all trains must wash down daily. James has just finished with his washdown and Gordon's driver tells him that it's his turn now. But Gordon angrily lets off steam and mud flies all over his driver, the workman, and even James. Gordon's driver scolds him and now he has to wait until James gets another wash. But Gordon does not wait and leaves to pull the express. The Fat Controller is waiting for Gordon at the big station and is shocked to see the big engine looking very muddy. He tells Gordon that Henry will have to pull the train instead and orders the former to get cleaned at once. After Gordon finally receives a washdown, he pulls and shunts trucks for the rest of the day, much to his anger, while James gets ready to take the express. Earlier, a storm swept across Gordon's hill, blowing leaves onto the tracks. Though the storm is over, the hill is still slippery. Gordon warns James about the hills being slippery and says that he may need help, but James denies this and leaves. James picks up speed as he tries to pull the train over Gordon's hill by himself when he comes to it. But halfway up, despite his best efforts, his wheels begin slipping on the leaves and he rolls back down the hill. Gordon sees everything, and after teasing James for not listening to his advice, he decides to help him up the hill. Then, thanks to Gordon pushing from behind, James makes it to the top of the hill. That night, Thomas asks the Fat Controller if Gordon could pull coaches again. The Fat Controller says that Gordon may, as long as he understands the importance of having a good washdown. As the other engines settle to sleep, Gordon states that he is a famous machine whether he is clean or dirty. Unfortunately, there is no one else left awake or around to hear him. I feel I should point out the obvious, that this story actually came after Off the Rails in the Railway series timeline. But because they never adapted it for the first series, they eventually decided to adapt it for the third series, so they had to come up with a new reason for Gordon pulling and shunting trucks for the rest of the day after his washdown. And the way they came up with it is actually a really good way. Somehow having mud blown over his smart blue paint and him not really caring to get a washdown and just wanted to get some work done.
Hello, Gordon, called Thomas. You look as if you've had a mud bath. Be a sensible engine and have a shower instead. Gordon snorted. I haven't time to dawdle over my appearance like fussy tank engines do.
You could say that this might be out of character for Gordon, but I don't think it is. In the TV series before this episode, and even in the Railway series, we've never seen one bit of Gordon who's concerned about his appearance in the same way that James or Henry are. Henry was concerned about his appearance in the sad story of Henry about the rain, and James is always concerned about his appearance. So it's not completely unbelievable that Gordon wouldn't care too much about his appearance. But it would definitely be out of character if they made James the main character who gets muddy, since he would probably complain about being dirty and demand to be washed down immediately. So the way they put Gordon in the position in the episode actually makes sense.
Mind my eye, he grumbled.
And Thomas asking the Fat Controller if Gordon could pull coaches again is taken from Paint Pots and Queens, which would later be adapted for the following series. And despite the changes to this adaptation, they really do capture the story really well. Especially the moment where James has to struggle up the hill with all those leaves on the tracks. Though it is quite funny that they called the episode The Trouble with Mud when it's mostly about leaves. Although if they did call it The Trouble with Leaves and Mud, that would have been a very long-winded title. And the first half of the episode is about being muddy, so I guess it makes sense. And the music that Michael O'Donnell and Jr. Campbell composed is really impressive, as they always are. And I love the bit of music they made for when James struggles up the hill and then rolls back down because of the slippery leaves. Starting with a new version of James's theme when he's struggling up the hill, and then changing to a Dangerfield theme when he's slipping down the hill because of the leaves. That was just an awesome bit of transitioning the two did with the music. And the moment of Gordon blowing mud onto James after he's just finished having his washdown is one of the funniest moments in the third series, and the TV series in general. Especially that hilarious noise Gordon makes in the early version of the episode.
Come on, Gordon, said his driver. You'll feel better too after a good hose down. Ah, said Gordon, and angrily let off steam.
And to this day I still find it hilarious the way Gordon handles the trucks and speaks to them when he's shunting in the yards. It's just such a great moment.
He felt his position deeply. That's for you, and you, and you.
and the way Michael Angelis performed it in the early narrations is so goddamn hilarious. And it's one of those lines I used to imitate a lot when I was a kid, mostly at times when I was reenacting the episode with my Ertel models and my Wood of Railway models. I just loved the way Gordon said those lines. And I do love how when Gordon gives James advice on going up the hill, James denies the offers, claiming that he doesn't need any help.
Be careful, warned Gordon. The hills are slippery. You may need help. I don't need help on hills, replied James huffily. Gordon thinks he knows everything.
It's just a great reminder that while Gordon and James are good friends, they don't always get along, because their different personalities can sometimes get in the way of their friendship. But in the end, their friendship does shine through. It just takes them learning a lesson to remind them of that. And when you look at it, it's like the polar opposite of James and the Express, where Gordon starts to get really boastful, ends up making a fool of himself, and James has to help him out of a situation. But this time around, James is the one who gets into the situation that Gordon has to help him out of. It's the equivalent of Gordon saying, well, James helped me out in the past. I think I should return the favour. It just shows how strong their friendship is despite their differences. And that's part of what makes this one of my favourite episodes in the TV series. The Trouble with Mud has always been one of my favourite episodes of the third series as a kid, and it still is all these years later. It's a fun episode that I definitely recommend checking out if you haven't seen it for ages. It's got some funny moments, some serious moments, and the chemistry between Gordon and James is a real highlight for the episode as well as the series in general. It's an episode that's definitely worth re-watching.
That's for you, and you, and you.
The 11th episode of the third series, No Joke for James, is based on the magazine stories The Express and A Passenger for James by Andrew Brenner. In this episode, the main focus is on James the Red Engine, a popular character among the fan base. But is it as good as a James episode as I remember it to be as a kid? Let's find out. Being a mixed traffic engine taking goods and passengers, James is proud of his smart red paint, and so is his driver, who tells him that he brightens up everyone's day. Shortly afterwards, one morning, James boasts to Thomas and Percy that he is the smartest and most useful engine on the line, though they both disagree with him. Later, as James boasts to Gordon that he is the pride of the line, Gordon tells him that he is only a goods engine. James lies to Gordon that the Fat Controller has plans for him, and Gordon believes him, much to James's concern. Thomas is shunting coaches in the yard. He tells James that they are for Gordon's Express and that he will fetch James's trucks next. James, however, decides to trick Thomas, lying that the Fat Controller told him that he is to take the Express and that Gordon is to pull the trucks. He is then coupled up to the coaches and steams out of the yard just as Thomas arrives with James's train of tankers for Gordon, leaving him and his driver shocked and furious. Meanwhile, James is puffing along the line and enjoying himself enormously, thinking to himself how clever he is. His fun does not last, however, when he finds the Fat Controller waiting for him at Elshbridge, and he quickly reprimands James for his naughty actions and sends him to his sheds as punishment. James ends up with Gordon and Henry teasing him by asking each other who will pull the Express now. The next day, James is let out of the shed and apologises to Thomas, who gives him his trucks. James then shunts in the harbour for the rest of the day as he pulls and pushes the trucks into place. As James and his crew prepare to head home, a gentleman arrives and tells the driver that he is to attend an important meeting with the Fat Controller. He must not be late for it and asks if he can ride in James, whose driver recognises the man as a railway inspector and agrees. When James arrives at Knackford, the railway inspector praises James. The Fat Controller agrees and tells James that he has once again proven himself to be a really useful engine. This is another big James episode that's really popular among the fans. And being a James lover myself, I really do enjoy this episode. It expands on James's personality by making him a little bit of a fibber, because we all know how splendid and vain he can be from the TV series and the Railway series, but this episode adds a new layer to him where he'll often tell a little lie.
The Fat Controller has plans for me. James was only making this up, but Gordon believed him. What plans? Asked Gordon. Wait and see. I'm taking the coaches. The Fat Controller asked me to tell you. What about the trucks? Give them to Gordon.
I took the liberty of bullshitting you, okay? You lied to me. It wasn't lies, it was just bullshit.
And it shows how his lies can later on come back to bite him up the arse.
Some jokes are funny, but not this one, James. You have caused confusion. You will stay in your shed until you are wanted.
And it reminds us that while he's a mixed traffic engine who could pull trucks and coaches, he would much rather prefer to pull passenger trains, since he doesn't get along very well with trucks. And this episode would also reuse a line that was earlier used in Time for Trouble, and this is the line that was reused from that episode.
Look at me, I'm the smartest, most useful engine on the line.
And in this scene where James pulls up in the yards to speak to Gordon about how he's the pride of the line, you can see a bit of the camera equipment in the background. Although I honestly don't remember seeing that in the early VHS versions of the episode. I think it's just a remastered version exclusive, which tends to happen a lot with the remastered versions of the episode. They'll often widen the screen so much that they'll reveal the end of a set, or a bit of camera or tripod. It's just something that they surely could have fixed up when they were remastering these episodes. But it's just a minor goof and doesn't come close to ruining this episode. And it should be worth pointing out that the railway inspector is Jeremiah Joblin from the first series episode, James and the Coaches. If you don't recognise him, he's the passenger that gave James's crew the leather bootlace so that they could fix the brake pipe in the coaches. It's kind of like in the original Thunderbirds series where they'll often reuse certain puppets to play different characters. And since they already had this sophisticated looking character from the first series, it only made sense to use him as a railway inspector. This episode subtly teaches the viewers a lesson that lying is never a good thing. Just like in Dirty Work when Diesel's lies were used to hurt Doug, but James's lies were never really meant to hurt anybody or cause any trouble. He just wanted a better job than pulling trucks just because he lied to Gordon about having a special job. But it teaches kids and other viewers in general that no matter what you lie about, it will come back to bite you in the arse eventually. And I adore the montage of James shunting in the harbour with the goods trains of trucks. Anytime the harbour shows up in the TV series is always a big highlight because of what a massive set it is and how busy it can be. And because they use models from the Tugs TV series, it really does give you Tugs vibes when you look at the backgrounds. Especially when you see Big Mickey in the background and some of the other boats. It just gives me proper Tugs vibes every time I rewatch episodes from Series 3 like this one. And because of my childhood of visiting Bristol Floating Harbour and riding on the steam train from there, it just fills me with childhood memories of visiting the harbour. No Joke for James is one of my all-time favourite episodes from the third series and the TV series in general, and if you haven't watched this one in ages, it's definitely worth checking out. It's another fun, memorable James-centered episode that shows more to his character other than his vainness and his boastfulness, showing that he's a little bit of a liar at times, just so he could get what he wants.
It wasn't lies, it was just bullshit.
It's easily among one of the best James episodes of the TV series, and it's definitely worth rewatching after all this time. Thomas, Percy and the Post Train is the 12th episode of the third series, based on the magazine stories The Post Train and After the Last Train written by Andrew Brenner. This is another episode that's extremely popular among the Thomas community, and it starts off a trope that's continued on through the series onwards. But I'll go into details about those after I go through the story. Late at night on the island of Sodor, after all the other engines have gone asleep in their sheds, an engine can still be heard in the distance carrying the Post Train. Thomas pulls two vans while Percy pulls the other two vans as the loads are too much for one engine to pull alone. Letters and parcels are loaded into trucks at both harbours before Thomas and Percy begin their journeys, travelling through the now silent stations making deliveries. Sometimes the light of the full moon on a clear night will light their way for them, or sometimes it will be so foggy that Thomas and Percy cannot even see the stars, but lamps will always be out to guide them on their way. Regardless of the weather, the two tank engines are happy to be entrusted with such an important job. Percy is left waiting for Henry due to the mainland mail ship being delayed. However, Henry finally gets the letters to him and the post train is filled. Percy tries his best to make up for lost time, but he is still very late and finishes his job after the sunrise. Percy does not mind this too much, appreciating the chance to get to see the island early in the morning with no one around. But he is not alone for long, as Harold lands and teases Percy over how late he is with the post. Percy is too tired to explain to Harold what happened, and he finally arrives back at the sheds just as Duck is getting ready to head out for the day, falling asleep before he even enters his shed. Percy and his driver decide to set off earlier than usual that evening. However, at the station they find Thomas, who has some bad news. The man in charge of the post has made a complaint to the Fat Controller about Percy being so late. Although the Fat Controller understands that it was not Percy's fault, the man would not listen. The two decide to be extra quick that night, when Harold lands telling the two engines that the post train will be apparently scrapped and deliveries will be made by him instead. He boasts to the engines that air is quicker than rails before taking off. Both Thomas and Percy are indignant and proceed on their way. That night everything runs perfectly and the two engines make very good time with all their deliveries. At a station, Thomas and his crew notice a man who missed his train, waiting cold and alone on the platform. Thomas's driver offers the man a lift if he does not mind being uncomfortable, to which the man is more than happy to accept. The next day, as Percy pulls his afternoon passenger train, he spots Howard looking miserable in his airfield. Howard explains that he has been grounded due to strong wind. Percy takes a chance to get his own back for earlier teasing by telling the helicopter that whales work wonders. That evening, the Fat Controller meets Thomas and Percy and reads them a letter from the man who missed his train. He says that the man is very thankful to the two engines for their help and the post train is the pride of the line. This makes the two engines very happy indeed. This episode is regarded among many Thomas fans to be a highlight in the TV series, and with good reason. It's the start of the post train for the island of Sodor, and it would become a staple for this series after this episode, having it making an appearance in various episodes in the TV series, and eventually becoming Percy's permanent job. This episode would also be the debut of the music that is known as the post train theme, which has become a staple for the TV series ever since, often playing in scenes where the engines are working late at night. It's just become so popular with the Thomas community that many fans on YouTube have tried to remake their own versions of the theme, and all of those themes that they've done are just so superb. And if you listen to the original theme on the TV series, you can see why they would recreate it so much. It's just such an iconic theme and just feels right for a night train job. You could honestly just listen to it for hours on end and be very happy to be able to hear it. And the track was so popular that Mike and Jr. would eventually make it a sing-along song called Night Train, which is one of the most popular sing-along songs in the franchise. Another reason people love this episode so much is that it's mostly set during the night. Much like the Flying Kipper, getting to see the island on a nighttime is just such a treat in the TV series. The lighting and the atmosphere is just so gorgeous. It really makes you appreciate the hard work that the people put into it on set, and behind the scenes. The events of this episode were mentioned by Thomas in the 23rd series episode, Wish You Were Here. It's just left that much of an impact on the fans. It also sees the return of Howell's egotistical and cocky side, as he keeps putting Thomas and Percy down about the post train and then eventually boasts about how he'll eventually take over the job, only to have it being thrown back in his face when karma bites him up the arse. It's a really good reminder of how, even though Harold gets along really well with the engines, his attitude and cockiness just gets the better of him sometimes. He's just a great character to work off of. And Thomas and Percy put on the post train at night is the first time we see some engines do nighttime jobs since Ron Road, when Gordon and Edward pull passenger trains late in the evening, and of course the Flying Kipper, where Henry the Green Engine pulls the Flying Kipper at night. It just adds to the many jobs the engines could do in Sodor. Thomas, Percy and the Post Train is another great memorable episode with a lovely atmosphere at night time. It's an episode that's remembered by many fans in the Thomas community, and with all those good reasons that I've listed. It's definitely worth rewatching time and time again. Trust Thomas is the 13th episode of the third series, which is loosely based on the magazine story Bertie's Bumpy Road by Andrew Brenner. This episode was so popular that it ended up having the VHS tape named after it, Trust Thomas and Other Stories. But is it really as good as the VHS makes it out to be? Let's have a look. It's a beautiful day and Thomas is puffing along his branch line with Annie and Clarabelle, enjoying himself enormously. He soon meets Bertie, who is having the most unpleasant journey driving over the bumpy roads. At the station, Thomas finds out that Bertie has lost his trust in the railway service after they failed to deliver tar to mend the road 2 weeks earlier, and resolves to find out the source of the problem. Meanwhile, James is complaining about having to do Percy's work while the green saddle tank engine is at the harbour, and takes his anger out by bumping his trucks, who vow to pay him out. Gordon advises James that if he pretended to be sick, he would not have to shunt trucks or go to the quarry, and James happily decides to try it. When Thomas arrives, James pretends to be ill and Thomas offers to take James's trucks for him to the quarry. The troublesome trucks, who are still cross at James for bumping them, decide to take their anger out on Thomas, deciding that one engine is as good as another. On the way back from the quarry, the trucks push Thomas over some points and onto a jetty, which floats across a muddy pond and sinks. Thomas finds the unexpected incident humiliating, especially since the day started so well, too. Duck handles the trucks, then Edward brings Thomas home on a flatbed. On the way, Thomas then remembers about the missing tar and informs Edward about it. He recalls a tar tanker was left at Wellsworth and offers to collect it to ensure that it reaches Bertie's road. James and Gordon apologise for the trick, and Bertie arrives saying that the road is being mended and he has regained his trust in the railway. Gordon and James slowly leave for the shed, but Thomas is still not alone, for it just so happens that a toad from the pond has stowed away on his valise for company and is looking forward to a ride home.
I say, you fellows, this is the only way to travel!
This episode was so popular that it got its name on the VHS tape released with 8 other episodes. And I can see why people in the TV series community likes it. It is a fun Thomas story that has James, Gordon and Bertie in it as well. And James's subplot of pretending to be ill, as suggested by Gordon, is loosely adapted from Sir Handel's subplot in Trucks from the Railway series book Little Old Engine. And I love the atmosphere of that yard that James and Gordon are shunting in. It's just so massive with loads of trucks everywhere and represents the busy working life of the railway. And I love the scene when James bumps the trucks through anger. Just the way he complains about having to do Percy's work, it's just so James-like.
James was snorting about in the yard. It's too bad, he grumbled. Percy goes to work at a harbour and I do his job. Here, there and everywhere. Take that. Oh, grumbled Trot. Just you wait, we'll show you.
It also carries on with James's tendency to sometimes not tell the truth from No Joke for James. Although James wasn't exactly alone in that lie, since it was actually suggested by Gordon.
I'll tell you what, James. If you pretend to be ill everywhere, you couldn't shunt trucks here or go to the quarry there, could you? What a good idea, agreed James.
And in the 4th series, he would later on suggest it to Sir Handel. And the scene when James is bumping the trucks in the yard. The scene goes wrong in the remastered version, where he bumps the trucks way too early before the sound effect kicks in. That was obviously a mistake that Hint Entertainment made when they re-released it on DVD for the remastered version, since in the original broadcasted version, the visuals and the sound effects are completely in sync. It was just another mistake that Hit made when re-releasing it and remastering it for DVD that they could have easily avoided. But like a lot of the other goofs that Hit Entertainment made for the remastered versions, this one doesn't ruin the episode at all. And I love the troublesome trucks' role in this episode as well, showing that even though the engine who's pulling them didn't do anything bad to them, they'll just take out their anger on them anyway, showing that trucks will be troublesome regardless.
We couldn't pay James back for bumping us, so we'll play tricks on Thomas instead. One engine is as good as another.
And to this day I still have no idea how they got that toad to move about in the episode. I don't know if it was string or an animatronic, I have no idea, but it just looks awesome. Just seeing that thing move without any evident strings or animatronics or anything. If anyone has their own idea on how that toad was able to move on its own, leave your suggestions in the comments below. I think it'd be fun to judge what it might have been. And even though they don't really focus too much on Percy's subplot with the bumpy roads, it's still a huge part of the episode since it gets a conclusion at the end. It's also the first time we get to see Bertie's angry face. And the crash scene in the episode isn't one of the most life-threatening ones, but it is one of the most entertaining ones to watch. Especially when you hear that funny comedy-like danger music during the scene. All in all, Trust Thomas is a fun episode with a fun crash and some fun subplots. I'd say it's definitely worth having its name on the old VHS tapes, and it's an episode that I would recommend checking out for anyone that loves Thomas episodes. It's got a fun crash, some fun moments, and it's just an all-around fun episode that you won't want to miss. Mavis is the 14th episode of the third series, based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book Tramway Engines. It took us till the third series to get to the remaining stories of the final book from the Railway series in Robert's Run. And this was the first episode of the third series to introduce a new character, that being Mavis the Diesel Engine, but I'll go into her details after I go through the plot. Mavis is a young new black diesel engine who works in the quarry at the end of Thomas's branch line, where she shunts trucks and puts them in their proper place. She has side plates like Toby to help prevent accidents on the line, but she is quite inexperienced and has her own ideas on how to do things, ideas she is very keen to implement. As a result, she puts Toby's trucks in different positions every day, making things hard for him, who tells Mavis off for this. Mavis, however, thinks Toby is just being fussy and boring and continues to do things her way until eventually Toby gives up and tells her she can take the trucks on her own to the station. Mavis is very pleased with this, as taking trucks makes her feel important. Later, at the goods station, Diesel meets with Mavis. When she complains to him about Toby claiming he says that only steam engines can manage trucks, Diesel sees a chance to cause trouble and tells Mavis that diesels are naturally better than steam engines before leaving. Mavis takes his words to heart, but she is oblivious that Diesel knows nothing about trucks. The line Toby uses crosses a main road behind the station before reaching a farm lane. Here, there is a dip in the line that can be very difficult to cross in frosty weather. Toby has found a solution to this. He stops before the dip, his fireman stops the traffic at the crossing, and then he takes a run at the dip, using the weight of the trucks to help push him across without trouble. It is the safest and easiest way to cross in the lane in frosty weather. Toby tries to tell Mavis about the farm lane and how to cross it, but she thinks that he's just being fussy and ignores his advice. Later, Mavis begins taking the trucks to the station, but does not realise that the trucks, who are tired of being bumped around, plan to pay her out. No surprise there. Mavis reaches the farm lane, but instead of stopping before the dip like Toby advised her to, she stops just before the road. Bertie and Terence halted, and Mavis, who believes she has got one over on Toby, tries to leave, but the trucks take advantage of her mistake and hold back. Mavis is unable to move despite her best attempts, leaving the trucks to laugh at her mistake. Workmen sand the rails and try to dig away the frozen mud, but to no avail. Mavis is stuck, blocking the crossing and making everyone who is caught in the resulting traffic jam cross. Back at the yard, Toby is angry when he is told what has happened. Toby's driver tries to calm him down, reminding him that Mavis is young and needs to learn. Toby is not interested and is willing to let her manage the trucks herself. Toby's driver reminds him that they are actually his trucks and Mavis is technically not allowed to leave the yard. Knowing that he will also be in trouble if the Fat Controller finds out, Toby decides to go and help her after all. Back at the lane, Mavis is facing an angry farmer who tells her what she could do with her train when Toby arrives to help.
I'm beginning to lose my rag with you, sweetheart. Now I'm going to count to 10, right? Then I'm going to shove these flowers right up your...
You realise that will be extra.
After a lot of pushing, Toby finally starts to move Mavis and the trucks back across the lane. The hard work makes Toby's fire burn fiercely, and his fireman spreads hot cinders to melt the mud. Finally, Toby and Mavis wind up at the beginning of the lane, and Toby wishes Mavis goodbye and leaves. Mavis is too humiliated to thank Toby for his help, but says nothing. She takes the trucks to the shed and quickly heads back home to the quarry as the sun sets. We've gone through most of Series 3 without getting a new character introduced, and this episode was the first to do it, that being Mavis the Quarry diesel engine. In this episode, she's naive, arrogant, and does not take advice very well. She was mostly interested in her own ideas, but was brought down to earth after her embarrassing incident at the Farquhar crossing. And it takes the events of the next episode to make her realise her mistakes, and makes her more willing to learn and take advice. She's based on the British Rail class 04060 diesel locomotive. She is more specifically based on the BR class 04s that worked on the Wisbech and Upwell tramway, as they were fitted with additional cow catchers and side plates and so they could run near public roads. And Mavis's paintwork just suits her down to a treat, mostly all black with the black and white stripes at her front and back. While this is a very, very faithful adaptation to the original story, they do make a couple of changes here and there. The most noticeable one is the fact that Diesel replaces Daisy's role from the original story. This was done because Shining Time Station co-creator Rick Ziegler disapproved of Daisy around this time.
How absurd.
And to be honest, I think it makes more sense that Diesel would be the one to take Daisy's role in the episode. Because at that point, Daisy had already been redeemed and made herself a better engine, so it wouldn't really make sense that she'd be bad-mouthing steam engines at that point. Now, you can understand it if the story took place before Percy's predicament, but since it took place many stories after that, it makes no sense that Daisy would suddenly be like that. Because Devious Diesel is this sort of character who disapproves of steam engines and thinks that he and other Diesels are better, it makes more sense for him to take the role. And it's just really cool to see Diesel again.
Depend upon it, Mavis. Anything steam engines can do, we diesels can do better.
There's also one line that was changed from the original book. When Toby tells Mavis off about putting the trucks in different places than where he wants them, in the original book she says, "Fudge!" But in the adaptation she says,
"Fiddlesticks."
This was likely done to avoid any criticism for alluding to profanity in the TV series. And we once again have the troublesome trucks causing trouble for an engine. And I love how they take advantage of Mavis's situation just so they could pay her back for bumping them around in the yard.
Mavis had stopped in the wrong place. Instead of taking Toby's advice, she had given the trucks the chance they wanted. "Hold back! Hold back!" they cried.
And the episode gives us a new version of the breakdown theme from series 1 and 2. And this version is a lot slower than the original versions, because the original version was more fast-paced. But this one goes at a much slower pace, so we're not rushing around or anything. And it matches with how slow Toby is pushing Mavis and the trucks back down the hill. And speaking of music, this would be the final time that the full outro music would be featured in an episode. Yeah, if you haven't noticed, this is the only time in Series 3 where we get to hear the full outro music, and it's also the only time in the third series. And it's the very final time that they did it in the TV series. I'm not really sure why this was the only episode of Series 3 they used it in, but I think it's very fitting that the final time they'd use it would be in an episode based on an Audrey story. It's just touchingly fitting to me. And if you've been paying attention to my previous reviews, you'll know that I love snow-related episodes. Which is why this one makes it on the top tier for me in episode-wise. Just looking at the quarry and the farm lane with all the snow, it's just so gorgeous. I really do appreciate the hard work that the team put into making the snow effects for the episodes. And this episode doesn't disappoint. Mavis is a great adaptation to the story with a few changes that doesn't ruin the story at all, but in some way makes it better. It's an episode that's definitely worth checking out if you love the Railway series and Mavis the Diesel Engine. It's among one of the best.
Fudge!
Now we come to the second part of Mavis's story in this series, the 15th episode of the third series titled Toby's Tightrope, based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book, Tramway Engines. This would be the episode that completes Mavis's storyline for the third series. But is it a satisfying conclusion to her short storyline? Let's take a look. One day, Percy arrives at the quarry to pick up some stone trucks. The only other engine in the quarry at the moment is Mavis, who is sheltering between rocks looking miserable. Percy tells the young Diesel to cheer up, but she explains that the manager found out about her going down Toby's line and causing trouble, so he has confined her to the quarry. She calls Toby a fusspot again, angering Percy, who tells her that Toby knows a lot more about trucks and that they must be left where he wants them. Percy then leaves to take his trucks to the harbour. Although Mavis likes Percy, she still does not understand why she cannot go down the line. The quarry sided arrangements were very awkward. Mavis is forced to make several trips going backwards and forwards, shunting a few trucks at a time if she wants to put them in the correct places for Toby. Mavis is desperate to leave the quarry and makes a plan. She starts by telling the driver the work would be a lot easier if they could use a small part of Toby's line. Suspecting nothing, the driver agrees and Mavis is allowed to go as far as the first level crossing. The weather changes a few days later, which melts the ice and snow away. This causes an increase in work and Mavis takes trains that are so long that she has to go beyond the level crossing. She decides to proceed with her plan to go further down the line without making it look like her fault and asks the trucks to bump her at the level crossing. The trucks agree, but things go awry when Toby arrives while she is gone and decides to shunt them himself. The trucks decide to bump Toby instead of Mavis, and when he reaches the level crossing, the trucks give him a fearful bump and push him down the line. Melted ice and snow have caused the river on Toby's line to become a torrent and wash away a crumbling wooden bridge after a log destroys a section of it, leaving only the rails behind which form a tightrope across the abyss. When Toby is finally able to stop after his driver fights for control, he is on the tightrope precariously above the water, ready to fall at any second as more pieces of the bridge crumble into the torrent. When Mavis hears about this, she is horrified and immediately goes to help. Toby is anchored to some rocks with chains as Mavis takes the trucks away. Eventually, she is able to pull Toby to safety and later apologises about what happened with the trucks. Toby thanks Mavis, telling her that while he has heard of the tightrope walkers from the circus, he had not imagined doing it himself. The Fat Controller sees Mavis later and congratulates her for doing well in an emergency. Mavis admits she was responsible for the trucks' behaviour, but asks if she can still use Toby's line, as Toby has offered to show her what to do. The Fat Controller agrees on the condition that Mavis's manager allows her to, which he does. Mavis is now happier than ever and is considered to be a really useful engine. For a rather short character storyline, this is a very fitting and well-deserved end for Mavis, getting to prove herself really useful and getting what she wants. And it just takes Toby getting into trouble with some troublesome trucks to get her to realise that she was wrong. The only major difference I could find with this episode compared to the original story is the fact that Percy gives her the pep talk instead of the manager. I think that's a really nice change, having someone that's almost as young as Mavis give her the advice, and the pep talk that she needs to put her on the straight and narrow. And they say that Mavis likes Percy in the episode, but they don't state if it's whether just as friends or as a like-like thing. But you can make the assumption that it's more as a friend thing. And for all of Hit Entertainment's faults during the CGI era of the show, they actually did play around with Percy and Mavis's relationship in the episode Percy's Parcel. While it is a bad episode, that is an element of that episode that I do like, giving Percy some screen time with Mavis for a change. It's a real shame that they never did it in any other episodes. Or maybe I just need to do a little more research on the CGI series. But they had the potential to give Percy and Mavis more spotlight episodes together, but they never took it. Another reason it makes sense for Percy to give Mavis the pep talk in the beginning of the episode is because Mavis is rather a lot like Percy in some ways. They're both young, naive, and they both make mistakes. Mavis even makes the same mistake that Percy made in Percy Takes the Plunge, where she asks the trucks to give her a bump at the level crossing, not knowing that she can't trust trucks. It's a similar thing to what Percy did, both engines not realising that they can't trust troublesome trucks. But this time, rather than the bad thing happening to Mavis, she ends up making it happen to Toby, which was never her intention. And I love that conversation between Mavis and the trucks. It's just really fun to listen to every time I re-watch it.
Can you keep a secret? She asked the trucks. Yes, 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 they chattered. Will you bump me at the level crossing and tell no one I asked you? The trucks promised.
And the scene of the bridge collapsing near the torrent is just amazing to look at, even all these years later. I mean, just the way the bits of wood on the bridge collapses from the bridge is just amazing to watch. It's something you wouldn't have thought about twice as a kid, but as an adult you can really appreciate how much work the team went into making this effect possible. And I have no idea how many takes it must have taken to get this scene right, but it's just amazing all these years later. Mike and Junior also treat us to a brand new version of the Runaway theme, giving us more instruments than the previous 2 seasons did, as well as raising the stakes at the end of the theme, giving a little nod to Tug's music. And I really love it when Mike and Donna and Junior Campbell bring in Tug's music into Thomas. It's just an amazing touch. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the first time we see the snow melt in a TV series episode. As I said, I may be wrong, but this is the first time I can remember the snow actually melting within the TV series. Since we've seen plenty of snow related episodes in the TV series, but we've never actually seen the snow melt in the episode. That makes this one the first. And I love that little detail they made in the episode. Toby's Tightrope is a very faithful adaptation to the original story in my opinion, and it's a fun way to end Mavis' storyline in the 3rd series. It's an episode that's definitely worth watching if you love Mavis, Toby and Percy and the Troublesome Trucks. It's an episode that's among one of the best, and a great wrap up to Mavis' storyline. It's definitely worth watching.
Yes, yes, yes.
Edward, Trevor and the Really Useful Party is the 16th episode of the 3rd series, based on the magazine stories Edward and the Vicar and the Vicar's Fate, written by Andrew Brenner. This would be the final episode to have an early narration by Michael Angelis, since it was the last episode to be released on an early VHS tape. One early morning, Trevor tells Edward that the Vicar is organising a garden party to fund the underprivileged children's seaside trip, and Trevor will be the party's main attraction. Edward wishes he could help, but knows he cannot be much help without his rails. Although he wants to be helpful like Trevor, his driver replies that he is helpful in his own way, which is on the Fat Controller's railway. The next day it is Trevor's turn to look worried because the Vicar had been so busy setting up for the party that he forgot to put up the posters for anyone to notice. Edward suggests an idea by having the Vicar paste the posters on him and his coaches to attract a lot of guests wherever he goes. Edward's driver gives the idea to the Fat Controller, who agrees. Sure enough, many people become attracted and decide to attend the Vicar's garden party. Later that afternoon, Trevor is resting in the orchard shed. Bertie the bus arrives and teases him about his advanced age and announces that he will also be at the garden party, bringing more guests there. Bertie then brags that not many people will want to ride on an old-fashioned traction engine after having travelled on him. Trevor ignores Bertie, knowing that the party would still be a success regardless. The party takes place the next day, but because it had rained during the night, the orchard ground is very soggy. Trevor knows that the rain and the mud will never spoil his day as they will stay on the road to prevent an accident. He soon puffs up and down the country lane, giving lots of children rides. Eventually, Bertie arrives bringing guests to the party and tells Trevor that people are coming from all over Sodor because Edward's idea has been a success. Trevor gives Bertie a cheerful whistle in reply, But when he makes his way back to the orchard, Bertie gets stuck in the mud while attempting to drop off his passengers at the party. Fortunately for him, Terence the tractor is also there and quickly helps get him out, joking that he is the one supposed to be ploughing fields, and Trevor notes that Bertie's boastfulness has caught up with him and now learned his lesson to never try go off-road again. Once back on the road, Bertie apologises to Trevor for calling him a stick in the mud, and the party is a great success. That evening, the vicar thanks Edward and his crew for helping to attract lots of guests. Edward feels very pleased and really useful, while Trevor falls happily asleep knowing that all the unprivileged children will finally be able to visit the seaside. This would be the final episode in the TV series for Edward to have a leading role until the 6th series episode, Edward the Very Useful Engine. It's also the last episode for Trevor the Traction Engine to have a leading role. And it's a real shame because a lot of people really love this character. So it would have been nicer to have seen some more episodes with Trevor as the main character. But for the final one in the TV series, this is actually really well written. I also love how they have Bertie interact with Trevor, since this is the first time the two have actually spoke to each other in the TV series. Yeah, if you look back at the past episodes, they've never actually interacted with each other. And since they're two road vehicles, it actually makes sense and it's a really great pairing. While doing research for this episode, I found out that Devious Diesel was meant to make an appearance in the episode, since a rare picture shows him originally appearing, probably to discourage Edward, but the scene was cut for unknown reasons. My guess is it was probably to save time because there's only so much you can have in a 4.5-minute episode. So I can understand them cutting the scene due to time restrictions, but at the same time it would have been a nice treat to have seen Diesel trying to discourage Edward. And it would have been a nice way for Devious Diesel to have his first interaction with Edward in the TV series. And you remember the old Marklin engine that used to appear in the background in Series 1? Well, it makes a guest appearance as a scrap engine in this episode. If you look really closely in the scenes where Edward and Trevor are in the scrapyards, you can actually see a little bit of the Marklin engine in the background. So it's a really lovely touch that even though they broke the engine apart, they still use its bits for bits in the background. That's a really nice touch, and reminds us that the Marklin engine existed back in the first series. And this must be the second time Bertie the Bus has ever had some sort of an accident in the TV series. The first time was when he was hitting holes in the road in Trust Thomas. But this is his first major accident since he gets stuck in the mud, because even though he ran into some bumps in the road on his way to the station, he still turned out fine with no flat tyres. But here he was actually in danger because his wheels had sunken deep in the soggy mud, and Terence and Trevor had to help pull him out. So this is really the first time Bertie the Bus has had a major accident in the TV series. What I love about this episode, and I'm sure a lot of other people love about it, is the fact that the road vehicles take centre stage here. While Edward is in the title, he's not really in the episode as much as Trevor is. But it's just really lovely to have Trevor and Bertie take up a majority of the episode as well as take centre stage, since very few episodes in the TV series actually focus on the road vehicles. Most of the episodes are focused on the railway engines, so it's a nice change of pace when we have an episode that focuses on the road vehicles. And as I said, this would be the last episode to have an early narration from Michael Angelis before its official release on TV. And this will probably come as no surprise, but I love the early narration a lot more than the redone version. And I know Bertie's yell for help sounds more serious in the redone version.
Help! I'm stuck! Shouted Bertie.
But I just love the way he does it in the early version more.
Help! I'm stuck! Shouted Bertie.
Because it's the version that I've watched most as a kid, it's the one I'm used to. Edward, Trevor and the Really Useful Party is another great episode that gives a lot of focus on some road vehicles for a change. It's another one of the episodes that doesn't have to rely on a crash scene or a chase scene to make it entertaining. It's just a piece of life episode that the TV series is well known for, and it's a nice change of pace to have the road vehicles take centre stage here. It's an episode that's definitely worth watching if you love Trevor the Traction Engine and Bertie the Bus. It's among one of the most charming episodes that definitely deserves re-watching time and time again. Buzz Buzz is the 17th episode of the third series, based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book, Mainline Engines. This was the first episode of the third series to not have an early narration before its TV release, since the first 16 episodes we covered had early narrations on the VHS tapes before their official release on TV with redone narrations by Michael Angelis. And this is the first to only have one version of narration for the series. Let's buzz on right over with the story. Trevor is enjoying his work in the vicarage orchard. It is a beautiful day with birds singing and apples ripening. James arrives and compliments how Trevor feels as well as his paint. After Trevor admits that he is bright and cheerful, James asks about a strange noise. Trevor explains that it is the bees that are making honey and that he needs to take the beehives to the station as the vicar is going to give some of her honey to his friends. When Boko arrives, he warns the two of them to not make the bees angry or they will sting. However, James ignores him and both engines leave to set off for the next station. Bill and Ben are busy arranging trucks, but they leave when they see Boko, who tells Duck about the time he first met the twins and how Edward soon put a stop to their games. Duck agrees that Edward is the only one who could keep Bill and Ben in order and then nicknames them the Bees. And Boko chuckles, finding it a good nickname as a result of their behaviour. James bustles in after having overheard a part of the conversation. He butts in asking Duck if he is ever afraid of bees and boasts that he would make the bees buzz off by blowing smoke at them, much to Duck's amusement. The next morning, James is preparing to pull the express. As the passengers prepare to board the train, the porter is in a hurry and accidentally knocks a beehive off the trolley, causing it to fall and break open. Like magic, everyone quickly takes cover outside the station and a swarm of bees buzz around James's crew in hopes that they will repair their hive. However, they are more worried that the bees will sting them, and so the bees cling onto James's nice and warm boiler instead. One of them burns his foot on a hot spot of James's boiler, and in retaliation stings the reg engine right on the end of his nose, leaving it red and swollen. This proves to be the final straw for James and his crew, so they run off without waiting for the guard's whistle and leave the express behind. They try different methods to get the bees off, such as spinning on the turntable, washing them off, and going through a tunnel to smoke them out. But all methods are unsuccessful no matter what. Finally, James's driver says the only thing to do is to go back to the orchard, which allows the bees to fly off when they see a beehive at Wellsworth Vicarage. Once back at the sheds, the vicar comes by to see James and gives his crew some jars of honey in gratitude for saving the bees. He also jokingly notes that, even though it is not Christmas yet, it would be a great idea to nickname him James the Red-Nosed Engine, much to James and his crew's amusement. Instead, the crew prefers to call him the Bee's Knees, as a sign of just how really useful he is. This marks the first time the TV series had used hand-drawn animation in the TV series, as the bee that burns itself and stings James's nose is a cell animation cartoon. And while the bee looks very cartoonish, despite it being taking place in a real-world environment, I have to admit it does look really cool. It's just awesome to see a bee drawn this way in the TV series. And while some could make the argument that it's weird seeing the 2D animated bee in a live-action thing since it just looks like a cartoon in the real world with no shadows like in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, you have to remember that this was a TV show and they wouldn't have had the budget to make the bee look as realistic as it would have been in Roger Rabbit. So for the time, this was really groundbreaking for the TV series. Since the original story takes place in between the Diseaser and Ron Road and was never adapted in the second series, they had to compromise and make some changes to the adaptation, with the beginning and ending of the episode. So the opening shot of James, Trevor and Boko at the vicarage was a nice way to introduce us to the bees and to build up the story. And in the original ending, James gets teased by the other engines, but in the new version it's the vicar that gives James his nickname. And the vicar's line,
"It's a pity it's not Christmas, then we could call you James the Red-Nosed Engine,"
is a reference to the old song Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, which is actually really fitting to talk about when you consider that this is Christmas time. And like with the original story, this episode starts off with James's prejudice with diesels, since he badmouths Boko in the episode. And when that story was originally written, James's motivation to have a prejudice against diesels was understandable, since diesels were new at the time the original story was written and they posed a threat to steam engines on the railways. And this is the second time we get to see James spin around really fast on a turntable, although in the remastered version he spins around a lot slower for some reason. And I don't get why they did that. It's another simple thing that they could have just avoided by getting the original footage. And the most noticeable and funny goof in the episode is that when the passengers are running out of the station after the beehive breaks open, one of the passengers is fallen over and lying down face first on the station floor. But I assume David Mitten or someone else on set decided that this was really funny and just decided to keep it in by having the passenger fall over and then get back up and continue running away. It's a goof that they just decided to keep in and then just run all the way with it by having him get back up. That's a nice little touch that the TV series had for this episode. And it's a scene that I look forward to rewatching every time I rewatch this particular episode. And it goes without saying that James looks hilarious with that big red nose after he gets stung. It's just such an iconic and hilarious moment of the TV series. And the episode is so iconic that various merchandise based on the episode has been made. Take and Play, Trackmaster, Wooden Railway, Wind-Up Toys. Even Thomas Land in Japan has a reference to it in the maze. And the Mid-Hants Railway did a reference to the episode as well with their James engine in the 1997 Day Out with Thomas event. It's one of those episodes that's left a huge impact with the Thomas community. All in all, Buzz Buzz is a fun, entertaining, funny episode for the TV series. It's the first time we get to see 2D animation in the series, and as I said, James looking like a circus clown gets me laughing every time I rewatch it. It's a fun episode that's definitely worth checking out if you love James the Wren Engine and bees in general. It's one that's not to be missed. Here's another hugely popular one, guys. The 18th episode of the third series, All at Sea, written by Britt Allcroft and David Mitten. This is the first episode of the third series to have a story written entirely by Britt Allcroft and David Mitten with no inspiration from the Audrey family or Andrew Brenner. And it once again focuses on Duck the Great Western Engine, fan favourite among the Thomas community. Percy and Duck enjoy working at the docks near the ocean, especially on a clear night. One summer morning, the two engines notice the horizon is packed with sails flapping against the sky. Duck tells Percy that he wishes he could sail to faraway lands, but Percy thinks it is silly since engines cannot float. Harold soon hovers and tells the two engines that the boats are competing in the regatta and that it is his job to hover around in case he is needed. Duck then asks Harold if he has ever been to the horizon, to which Harold says he has, and can also land on ships, aircraft carriers, anywhere at any time. Duck then goes on talking about the regatta for the rest of the day, leading Percy to lose patience and tells Ducks that their rails could take them to all the places they could ever wish to see. Suddenly, the harbour emergency siren goes off. A man taking place in the regatta has suffered a hand injury and Duck needs to take him to the hospital at the next station. Harold brings the man ashore and Duck quickly races over. Harold states that he would have taken the man to hospital himself, but he needs to stay at sea in case of other emergencies. Duck soon makes his way down the line and arrives at the station, where the grateful sailor is dropped off and Bertie prepares to take him to the hospital. Bertie then compliments Duck, saying that he looks splendid flying along the line, and it is no wonder that they call him Great Western. After Percy drives away, Duck then agrees with Percy that engines are happiest when their wheels are firmly on the rails. Later that night, Duck notices a shooting star as he and Percy are staying a bit longer at the warm and calm quay. Percy laughs and tells him that it is Harold hovering overhead. Something flutters down towards Duck and his driver manages to catch it. It is a flag from the regatta that Harold has given to Duck as a present, which Duck sees as kind of Harold, and he begins to understand just what an engine needs. At this point, Duck still dreams about travelling to the horizon, but knows that he will never be happier than when he is with his friends on Sodor, and understands now that sometimes the best travels are those that only exist in dreams. This episode is one of the most gorgeous ones I've ever seen, since it mostly takes place around the harbour. And as I mentioned before, I have childhood memories of going to Bristol Harbour and riding on the trains and looking at the boats. And like Henry's Forest, this one takes a character from the existing books and adds more to their personality. Mainly Duck, having him be a character that wishes that he could travel to faraway lands after watching all the boats on the regatta, dreaming about the lands beyond the horizon.
I wish I could sail to faraway lands, sighed Duck. Engines can't go sailing, snorted Percy, because engines can't float.
It just adds more to his character other than just being proud of being Great Western. And it shows that while just talking about your dreams for hours on end can become annoying to people, as it was shown with Duck and Percy. With Percy managing to bring Duck back down to earth when he loses patience with his bragging about the horizons and the regatta.
Well, Duck, I'd rather have my wheels on solid ground. Our rails can take us to all the places we could ever wish to see. Percy's right, Duck thought to himself. Engines are happiest when their wheels are firmly on the rails.
And when you look at all the scenes in the episode, they're just so gorgeously filmed. From the daytime scenes during the regatta to the nighttime scenes. And I'm one of those people who, while love steam trains, I also enjoy seeing the boats on the harbour as well. Especially the summer of this year when I went to the Dartmouth regatta with my parents. Having some fish and chips along the quay, watching all the boats have their races, and getting to see the Dartmouth Railway steam train go by every now and then. It's just such a wonderful sight to see all these fins when the regatta was taking place. And it's worth pointing out that the final shot of the episode is one of David Mitten's favourite in the entire series. He liked it so much that he framed a print of it and gave it to Britt Allcroft, who has also said this is one of her favourite episodes, alongside the first series episode Down the Mine. And during the memorial videos of David Mitten after he passed away, a lot of videos on YouTube have ended with this shot. And you can honestly understand why. Not just because it's one of Mitten's favourite scenes in the entire series, but also because it's so beautifully shot. Just that image of Thomas, Duck and Percy looking at the sunrise on the harbour is just such an amazing and beautiful scene. It's one of those moments that's well remembered for the TV series, even though it only lasts for about 10 seconds. It just shows you what great of a director David Mitten was and how he knew how to use the right angles with the cameras. And in a clever little reference to Percy's promise, when Harold drops the regatta flag down to Duck, the same music and sound effect were used from that episode for this episode. And as I said, this episode was written by David and Britt without any inspiration from Brenner or the Audreys. And for an episode that was written by the two of them without any inspiration from other stories, this was really well written, adding something more to Duck's personality and just getting to see some of the beautiful sceneries at the harbour, especially when you see the regatta moments. It's just so beautifully written and shot. And the ending speech by the late Michael Angelis is just one of the most charming and beautiful moments ever heard in the TV series. All in all at Sea is one of the most beautifully shot, beautifully written and all around beautiful episodes of the TV series. It adds more layers to Duck's personality, it shows more of the harbour and introduces the regatta to the TV series, and it's just another one of those fun days in the life of Sodor episodes. It's an episode that's definitely worth checking out if you love the TV series. It's not to be missed.
Duck still wonders about the lands beyond the horizon, but he enjoys being with friends most of all, and I think he knows that sometimes the best travels are those we can only dream about. Don't you?
One Good Turn is the 19th episode of the third series, based on Andrew Brenner's magazine stories Head On and Pulling Together. This episode focuses on Bill and Ben the Tank Engine twins, who are two of my favourite characters of all time in the series. And this was their first story to not be based on an Audrey story. But is it any good? Let's take a look. One morning, the Fat Controller sends Bill and Ben to help in Edward's yard. When they arrive, they meet Boko, who is resting and tease him like usual, and then start shunting. Soon they finish, and as a reward for their hard work, they are allowed to go on the turntable for the first time. Bill goes first and stays on the table until the foreman orders him off. Unfortunately, Bill is accidentally sent onto the same line as Ben, and they end up buffer to buffer. They argue about who is in the way until the Fat Controller finally breaks them up, and warns them that if they do not behave, he will not allow them back to the yard again. Each twin blames the other for the incident, and the next day they decide to give each other the silent treatment and badmouth one another to Boko and Edward. Eventually, Edward and Boko at the end of their rope make a plan to get Bill and Ben back together, which is then carried on to the Fat Controller. The Fat Controller tells the twins that Boko is taking a special train to the harbour and that they are to take his heavy goods train, Ben claims to be able to pull the train by himself, but he discovers it's too heavy for him to move alone. Then the twins realise their mistake and laugh. They work together to pull the train, therefore making up for their quarrel. The title of this episode is a shortened form of the idiom, one good turn deserves another. And as I said, it's the first Bill and Ben centred story since Series 2. And for the first one to not be written by an Audrey, I think it's really entertaining. I mean, we'd seen Bill and Ben have their arguments in the second series when they first appeared, but this episode shows how far their arguing could go until they eventually have a falling out, like all siblings do. That's what makes me love this episode even more as an adult. How siblings and best friends could get into bickerings with each other, have a falling out, and then through some series of events realise their mistakes and make up for their quarrelling. These days it just puts me in mind of me and my brother when we would have our little fallings out and then make up for it in the end. The main reason I loved it as a kid and still love it for this day is how funny the story is. Showing Bill and Ben still being their same old cheeky selves, the fun Bill has on the turntable, and how they get into their quarrelling with each other.
I was here first, said Bill. But you're in my way, protested Ben. You'll have to back up again. I won't. You will. I won't.
It's just so much fun to watch because these two characters are some of the most entertaining characters in the franchise.
Ben was coupled up to the train of trucks, but they were too heavy for him to move alone. Go on, teased Bill. I can't, said Ben.
This is also the first time we get to see them in another location that isn't the China Clay Works or the harbour. Because in the previous series, we've never actually seen them go anywhere aside from the harbour and the China Clay Pits. This is the first time they've entered a yard, which is a nice big step up for the two. And I'm not sure how many people remember this, but the Fat Controller's line,
I need you to help the other engines,
was used as a voice sample for the Thomas coin-operated rides by R.G. Mitchell. And it's one of those rides I used to go on endlessly as a kid. And I love all the Tugs music motifs that are in this episode. Music motifs from Tugs are scattered all over the third series since it was the same composers, but a number of them are very evident in this episode. I mean, I can't be the only one that hears this, but when Bill and Ben bump into each other, the little music motif that plays is the same as Izzy Gomez's theme from Tugs. I mean, just listen to it very carefully, it very sounds much like Izzy Gomez's theme.
They gazed grimly at each other.
And since Mike and Junior composed the music for the TV series as well as Tugs, it would make sense that a couple of motifs from Tugs would make their way into this series, since Tugs was Thomas's sister series. It's just really nice that we get some nods to Tugs other than the models. One Good Turn is one of those episodes that I always look forward to rewatching on the DVD just because of how entertaining and funny it is at times. It's a great episode for Bill and Ben to be the centre of attention of once again. It's got a lot of funny moments, and it plays on the real life situations of best friends and siblings getting into arguments with each other and then making up near the end. It's an episode that a lot of people can relate to when they have best friends and siblings, and it's one that's definitely worth watching if you love Bill and Ben the Tank Engine twins. It's one of the two's best episodes in my opinion. Now we're back in Wilbert Audrey territory, folks, with the 20th episode of the third series, Tender Engines, based on the story Tenders for Henry from the Railway series book, Enterprise in Engines. This is an episode that was going to introduce a famous steam locomotive from the real world, but couldn't due to budget restraints. But I'll go into more details after I go through the story. Gordon grows agitated when he is criticised by James for taking on too much coal and from Duck for taking on water from a temporary standpipe. He claims that big engines have big needs and little engines are just annoying. Later, Gordon is impressed when he sees a visitor with two tenders and wishes he had the same. But he becomes depressed when Diesel arrives and gloats about how Diesel's victory over steam engines on the mainland. Gordon's mood worsens when Duck and Henry tease him about boiler ache the next day. But he perks up when the Fat Controller assures him that steam engines will never be obsolete on his railway. The Fat Controller also mentions that the visitor had two tenders due to the shortage of coal and water between stations on the mainland. While Gordon feels much better, Henry is cross and says that he deserves two tenders for his hard work. Duck decides to play a trick on Henry with Donnell's help and courses Henry into pulling some spare tenders. Henry is initially delighted, but when he comes to claim them at the end of the day, he finds out that they are old, dirty, and filled with boiler sludge. As the other engines watch Henry grudgingly pour his tenders through the station, Gordon teases him with the same joke Henry used earlier.
Had a good wash out, Henry, called the voice. That's right, you'll feel a different engine now. Henry was not sure, but he thought the voice belonged to Gordon.
If you haven't guessed by now, the two tenders in the episode belong to the famous Flying Scotsman, who was originally intended to have a much larger role in the episode. But due to budgetary constraints, the entire locomotive model could not be constructed and never appears. As a result, Flying Scotsman was rewritten oddly as a stranger to Gordon rather than his brother. Of course, we all know Flying Scotsman would later appear in The Great Race, where he is properly established as Gordon's brother. I can only imagine if they'd have been able to finish the model, then his role would have been much the same as it was in the book. Have him come over to the island to cheer Gordon up when he finds out about how steamers have been abolished and how most of his classmates and brothers from Doncaster have all been scrapped. It's safe to assume that this is probably how the episode would have gone if they had been able to finish the Scotsman, but since the budget didn't allow them to finish anything other than the tenders, then they had to compromise and do something else with it. And for something that was beyond their control, I think they worded it in really well. I especially love how Diesel was the one that told Gordon that the Diesels are taking over on the mainland, which plays to the real life thing about how steam has been abolished in Great Britain in the 1960s, and how Diesels took over the whole railways, which paves the way for the events that are to come in the next episode. But I'll get into that when I talk about the next episode tomorrow.
Everyone knows that tenders are a mark of distinction, but I'm afraid that no amount of tenders will save you in the end. We Diesels are taking over, and we don't need tenders to make us important. Not even one. Gordon was most upset.
Some might see it as a missed opportunity for them to not bring up Gordon's Doncaster brothers that had all been abolished with most of the steam on the mainland, since that was a heavy thing for Gordon in the Railway series, making him realise that he's not going to live forever.
Cheer up, Gordon, said the Fat Controller. I can't, sir. The others say I got boiler ache, but I haven't, sir. I keep thinking about the dreadful state of the world, sir. Is it true, sir, what the Diesels say? What do they say? They boast that they've abolished steam, sir. Yes, Gordon, it is true. What, sir? All my Doncaster brothers drawn the same time as me? All gone, except one. The guard's whistle blew, and Gordon puffed sadly away.
But because they weren't able to finish the rest of Flying Scotsman's model, you can understand why they made that change. And having the Fat Controller reassure Gordon that steam will never be abolished on his railway, it's just very reassuring to me.
Cheer up, Gordon, said the Fat Controller. I can't, sir. Is it true what Diesel says, sir? What does he say? That Diesels are taking over. Don't worry, Gordon, that will never happen on my railway. And one more thing, sir. Why did the visitor have two tenders? Because he lives on a railway with long distances between coaling depots.
And most of Henry's old tenders have NE on the sides, indicating that they are North Eastern Railway gallon tenders. And by the way, because the Thomas community will probably kill me if I don't bring this up, this episode introduced one of the show's many memes. That being this one.
I wouldn't drink too much of that water if I were you, Gordon. It might give you boiler ache. Pah, said Gordon. What's this? Educating Gordon Day. First James and now you, Doc. Big engines have big needs. Little engines are just annoying.
I've just seen a meme for that quote pop up pretty much everywhere on the internet. It's one of those random quotes from the TV series that's just become so popular that it ended up becoming a meme somehow. And I love it for that reason. I also love in the opening of the episode how we actually see Gordon taking on coal and taking water from the standpipe, since they mentioned it in the opening of the book but we never actually got to see it. All we had to go by was James and Duck bringing it up to Gordon when he says that he isn't happy. So getting to actually see these two things happen in the episode is just what makes it slightly better than the original story. Of course, it would have been even more better if the Flying Scotsman had appeared properly, but you can't have everything sometimes, can you? But for what they had to work with, I think this is a really well adapted story. Not being able to finish the Flying Scotsman model completely due to budget restraints, so they had to improvise and come up with something new. And to add Diesel into it is just a highlight. I know I've said this quite a number of times before, but it's always a highlight for me to see Devious Diesel pop up every now and then in the episodes. It just reminds us that he's still a devious presence and still poses a threat to steam engines with his nasty words. And despite not featuring properly in the episode, the Flying Scotsman became so popular in the Thomas community that he ended up being sold as toys a few times. As a narrator model, which is just a repainting of Gordon's model, 2 wooden railway models, and a quite impressive Hornby model as well. Even though it's just Gordon's face, but it's still cool to have a Thomas version of the Flying Scotsman in Hornby form. Tender Engines is an episode that I used to re-watch a lot of times whenever I put it on VHS and DVD, and I continue to do so to this day. It's an entertaining story with a funny ending. It's nice to see Gordon and Henry take centre stage in the episode, and it's just all around entertaining. It may not have Flying Scotsman have a big appearance in this episode, but we would get to see him in a big appearance years later during the show's Renaissance era, and it's definitely worth a watch for those reasons alone. Here we go folks, arguably the most popular episode of the 3rd series. Escape, the 21st episode of the 3rd series based on the story of the same name and Little Western from the Railway series book Enterprise and Engines. This story introduces us to Oliver the Great Western Engine and his brakeman Toad, 2 of the most popular characters on the show. One day Edward is talking to Trevor when Douglas steams past and scolds Edward for talking instead of working, much to the latter's annoyance. Edward later meets Douglas again and tells him that both he and Trevor have a lot in common as they were both nearly scrapped. The mere mention of the word makes Douglas shudder. Edward continues explaining how Trevor is now really useful, but thinks that the railway could use another steam engine, to which Douglas agrees. Later that night, Douglas has taken a goods train to a faraway part of the island where only the diesels work. He is shunting for his return journey when he hears a hiss of steam. He pauses and hears the hiss again. A voice comes from nearby, asking if he belongs to the Fat Controller. The engine reveals himself as Oliver, who has run away from being scrapped with his brakeman Toad, but has run out of coal. Douglas is still nervous at hearing the word scrap, but then remembers Edward's story about Trevor and decides to help. Both engines' crews work hard to rescue Oliver and Toad. Douglas begins the journey by running tender first of bringing the 2 to the Fat Controller's railway. Just before they clear the station, a foreman and his watchdog stop them. Douglas's driver explains that Oliver and Toad belong to them, and although wary at first, the foreman lets them continue. It is daylight when they finally arrive. Douglas's driver finds a place at the works for Oliver, who thanks them all. The next day, Douglas tells the engines all about Oliver. They think Douglas should tell the Fat Controller about him at once, just as he arrives. He explains that unless a steam engine is saved from scrap, there is little hope to find one. Luckily, the Fat Controller already knows about Oliver and decides that he will work on Duck's branch line. The engines whistle and cheer in delight. Oliver and Toad are restored and both painted in Great Western colours. The other engines laugh and call the branch line the Little Western at first, but it delights Duck and Oliver. It will always be referred to as such from then on. This episode is regarded as one of the most popular for the franchise, and with good reason. It's the first episode to see a steam engine being saved from scrap. In fact, it's the first time a character in the franchise has been saved from scrap since Trevor the Traction Engine, which was brought up in the episode as well. And it introduces us to 2 new characters, Oliver the Great Western Engine and his brakeman Toad. Despite his heroism and daring feats of escape, Oliver is an engine who is willing to admit every day is a learning curve. When he was still new to Sodor, he let the other engines' responses to his courage, resource and sagacity from his amazing recounts of daring escapes and adventures get to his smoke boss, he became conceited. But in the next episode he learns this lesson about not being conceited and never making mistakes about trucks. But we'll get to all that in the next episode. Oliver is based on the Great Western Railway 14XX class 042T tank engine. These engines were fitted with a mechanical system allowing the driver to control the locomotive remotely from the cab of an auto coach. And since his debut in the TV series, Oliver has become one of the most popular characters in the franchise. I think it's something to do with his personality and his basis, and the fact that he's the 2nd Great Western Railway engine on the island of Sodor. He's just left a huge impact with the Thomas community after all these years. We're also introduced to Oliver's faithful brakeman Toad, who was polite and gentlemanly. He's also somewhat imaginative and a bit of an optimist. Toad minds his manners well and is always quick to refer to the engines as Mr., Miss or Sir. Not that much is actually known about Toad in this series because he didn't actually get a speaking role until the 4th series. But with his facial expressions you generally got the idea that he was polite and gentlemanly, and his personality would definitely shine through from series 4 onwards. Toad is based on a GWR 1625-ton brake van, and these brake vans are a common sight on heritage railway lines. Such brake van can also be sighted on the Bristol Harbour Railway, where it is used to take visitors on a steam train ride, where the visitors can ride in the brake van and some trucks with seats in them. This sort of brake van is just a very common sight on heritage lines these days. This episode takes the last 2 stories from Enterprise and Engines and combines them into one, which really did make sense since they didn't adapt Flying Scotsman due to the budget, so it made sense to combine those 2 stories into one. The only major gripe a lot of fans may have for this adaptation of the stories is the fact that Alice and Isabel, Oliver's coaches, don't get an adaptation in this episode. They don't get an appearance in the adaptation at all, and we wouldn't see Great Western Railway slip coaches until the CGI series. But that doesn't 100% take away from how great this episode is, and I suppose making those 2 characters wouldn't have been in the budget at the time. Another change from the book is the fact that the opening scene gets to see Douglas talking to Edward about Trevor and the idea of scrap, something that was never actually done in the book. It starts off on the night when Douglas saves Oliver from being scrapped, and that faraway part of the island where only the diesels work just has a creepy and eerie atmosphere to it, looking like the sort of place where steam engines just dread to go. And if I were there in real life, I don't think I'd want to be there for that long either. Just seeing all those various diesels all around the yards and no signs of a working steam engine, and some scrapped engines as well. That would just be a place I would not want to visit. And speaking of diesels, the diesels that appear in this episode are all characters that were already established, so we get to see cameos from Boko, Mavis and Devious Diesel. And I think it's self-explanatory that these are not meant to represent Boko and Mavis since they're friendly diesels, so they could of course represent other members of the class. And it's likely that Devious Diesel is among the crowd since he is one of many. So it's likely that Devious Diesel is a part of the crowd and other members of his class are there as well. And Oliver's escape theme is just such an epic theme in this episode. It's become one of the most iconic and epic themes in the TV series, being recreated by many users on YouTube, and with good reason. Whenever you listen to it in the TV series as well as the remade versions, it just sounds so goddamn epic. Put this theme in any escape movie and feel really satisfied just to hear how epic and grand it is. The episode once again plays on the theme of scrap, since it was a huge deal at the time the book was written, and it became a huge deal by the time the TV series came into its 3rd series, something that steam engines dread, and it seems like a death sentence to them. And there's a nice way to remind us of Donald and Douglas's predicament when they first arrived on the island in Brake Van, how neither one of them wanted to go back to Scotland because neither one of them would have been turned to scrap if they did. So it's one of those dark elements that makes its way into the TV series, and is a warm welcome for many TV series fans who've read the books. Escape remains to be one of the most iconic and popular episodes of the TV series, and as I've said a number of times, with all those good reasons. It's on a grand epic scale. We get the introduction of Oliver the Great Western Engine and his faithful brakeman Toad, and the escape theme from Michael Donnell and Junior Campbell is just top notch. It's an episode that's definitely not to be missed. It's one of the greats. Oliver Owns Up is the 22nd episode of the 3rd series, based on the story Resource and Sagacity from the Railway series book Oliver the Western Engine. This is part 2 of Oliver's storyline for series 3. But is it any good today? Let's take a look. Oliver is still new to Sodor and tells Duck how very grateful he is that Douglas rescued him and Toad from being scrapped on the other railway. Henry, James and Gordon praise Oliver one night in the sheds. Gordon even claims that he is sagacious and is an example to the others. Unfortunately, Oliver, who has never been complimented by big engines before, soon becomes puffed up in the smoke box. After Oliver pulls a couple of coaches to Tidmouth the next day, he is told by the Fat Controller that he must learn how to handle trucks, because every wise engine knows that troublesome trucks can never be trusted. However, Oliver is so confident in himself that he ignores the other engines' warnings. Duck tries to convince Oliver how trucks are troublesome, but Donald says it would be better for Oliver to learn on his own. After arranging some loaded trucks then shunting empties to the hopper, Oliver returns to take the loaded ones. However, they are comfortable where they are and do not want to move. They say they prefer Duck or one of the Scottish twins instead of Oliver. Oliver orders the trucks about and takes them anyway, which in turn they retaliate by forcing him down the tracks. Oliver puts his weight against the trucks, but they still push him on, unaware of the danger ahead. He is headed towards the turntable currently in use by Duck. Just when it seems Oliver is gaining control, he falls bunker first into the turntable well. Duck, having seen everything, speaks his concern about the predicament, as Donald and Douglas will now have to work without the use of the turntable. That evening, the breakdown train rescues Oliver. The Fat Controller kindly says that Oliver has a lot to learn about the troublesome nature of the trucks, to which Oliver agrees and is sent to the works to be mended. Duck sadly watches him being taken to the works by Douglas and calls out to him to come back soon. Since Oliver's return, he is a much wiser engine and now knows how to handle trucks. This episode gives Oliver the chance for his personality to really shine through, since he was only just introduced in the last episode, so we didn't get to see much of his personality. This is where his personality truly shines. And he's another one of those engines that learns the hard way how troublesome trucks can be. And Oliver's accident in the episode was based on a real life event where a Lancaster and Yorkshire 242T tank engine from the London, Midland and Scottish Railway also fell backwards into a turntable well. It really shows how much research Robert Audrey did when he was writing the stories, taking real life events and putting them into the stories for his books. Aside from the title change of this adaptation, another thing that also changed was the fact that the small railway engines Rex, Bert and Mike didn't turn up in the episode. But that was mainly due to the fact that they didn't really have the budget or the technology to make the small railway engines work in the model sets, since they would have had to have made really small models, but they just didn't have the money, the time or the skills to do so at the time. They didn't even have the techniques to do the narrow gauge engines at the time. So it is a bit of a loss for Railway series lovers who loved the Arsdale small railway engines, but that doesn't completely ruin the story. And a slight continuity error with this episode I found after rewatching it is the fact that the interior of Tidmouth Sheds just doesn't match how it was in the first 16 episodes, or even from the outside of the sheds. I mean, when you look at the outside of Tidmouth Sheds, it's clearly got 6 berths in it at that point. But the inside of the shed in this episode has like 7 or 8 berths in it. And I suppose you could make the argument that this is meant to represent another engine shed. But in the final episode of this series, it's established that it is Tidmouth Sheds. And I don't know why they have a different interior from this episode onwards, but it is kind of distracting when you look back at it. But at the same time, it is a cool looking interior for an engine shed, fitting in more than 6 engines compared to Tidmouth Sheds. So despite that little continuity error, this is a really cool looking interior for an engine shed, and I have no idea why they never used it again for a different shed in the future of the series. This is also the first time Gordon, James and Henry have a free catchphrase thing aside from the
Disgraceful, said Gordon. Disgusting, put in James. Despicable, finished Henry.
Here they get to say,
Amazing, remarked Henry.
Oliver, said James. That's resource.
And sagacity, put in Gordon.
That's a nice change from what they said back in Series 2. And we once again get to see the troublesome trucks at their full troublesomeness, pushing steam engines along the line and causing them to derail. It's further proof that troublesome trucks don't really care what happens if they bump another engine, they're just happy to have some fun. They're like naughty children who don't know any better. I also really love here how the trucks tend to prefer certain engines pulling and pushing them, much like how they did in Percy's predicament when they weren't used to Percy and just wanted Toby back. It's a nice bit of continuity there.
They were comfortable. and didn't want to move.
What right has he to poke his funnel in here? They grumbled. We want Duck. Or Donald. Or Douglas.
Anybody care about what I want? I do. Shut up. Get up.
And of course the story Toad Stands By that comes after this story wouldn't be adapted until the 4th series, so we'd have to wait another series for the conclusion of this story. But for what they were able to do with this episode, I think it really pays off. It's just so much fun to watch the episode entirely, and that accident is just one of the most iconic in the TV series. Oliver Owns Up is a fun episode about Oliver the Great Western Engine, another one of the show's most iconic characters. It's got so many fun moments, the crash scene is just spectacular, and it's an all-around enjoyable episode that you won't want to miss. It's definitely worth a watch. Bulgy is the 23rd episode of the 3rd series, based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book, Oliver the Western Engine. This is the last episode of the 3rd series to introduce a brand new character, that being Bulgy the double-decker bus. But I'll go into his personality once I go through the plot of the episode. A special bank holiday is being celebrated in the springtime on Sodor, and many visitors are travelling on Duck's branch line. Bertie and the other engines are all kept very busy, taking them to and from their destinations. One day, Duck is waiting at tib mode when he spots a large and unfriendly looking double-decker bus. He grumbles as he sees the happy passengers boarding Duck's train, and states that he would not have brought them if he had known that they would be travelling by railway. He bluntly tells Duck that one day the railways will be torn up and replaced with roads. Duck is shocked by the bus's behaviour and states that Bertie would have never made such claims. The bus is dismissive of Bertie's opinion, declaring him too small in size to be of any use. At Holtrove, Duck meets Oliver and tells him all about the bus. Oliver explains that he calls the bus Bulgy and simply laughs off his threats. That afternoon, however, Oliver is much more serious since another equally rude bus arrived and has taken Bulgy's passengers so Bulgy himself can take those of the 2 Great Western engines to the big station. Duck insists that the route is quicker by rail, but Oliver explains that Bulgy apparently knows a shortcut. Later, Duck prepares for the homeward rush, but is surprised to discover he has less passengers. Then Oliver spots them in Bulgy, who also has a sign on his side claiming he is a railway bus. Bulgy leaves and Duck quickly follows after him. Some time later, he is flagged down at a bridge where the line crosses a narrow road, where he discovers that Bulgy has wedged himself under the bridge. The passengers explain that Bulgy tricked them, as he wanted them to think railways were no good. He claimed to be a railway bus, but he would not accept their return tickets. Duck and his crew agree that helping the passengers outweighs the risk of the damaged bridge and cross it carefully. Bulgy begs him to stop as bricks fall from the bridge, fearing it might collapse on top of him. Fortunately for Bulgy, the bridge does not collapse, although Duck sternly states that it would have served Bulgy right for line if it had. Duck soon arrives back at the big station and all of his passengers catch their trains on time. The bridge is eventually repaired, but Bulgy's ways remain unchanged until he is eventually taken out of service. He is now a hen house in a field beside the bridge, and any lies he does tell are ignored by the resident hens. This episode introduces us to another fan favourite among the Thomas community, Bulgy the rude double-decker bus. He is a grumpy, cold-hearted and cynical double-decker bus who firmly believed that roads are superior to railways and would occasionally lie to get himself out of trouble. He even lies to the passengers about being a railway bus despite not accepting their return tickets, since he is what the Thomas community refers to as anti-railway.
He tricked us, shouted Bulgy's passengers. He said he was a railway bus, but he wouldn't accept our return tickets. He wanted us to think railways are no good.
And I love the voice Michael Angelis gave for Bulgy in this episode. This gruff northern voice that is really unfriendly.
Stupid nonsense, he grumbled. I would have brought them if I'd known, and have had a breakdown or something. I'm glad you didn't, smiled Duck. You'd have spoiled their fun. Ah, enjoyment is all you engines live for. One day railways will be ripped up. Doc felt shocked at such an idea. We have a friend called Bertie, and he's a bus, but he likes the railway. Sometimes he teases us about it, but he'd never want to see it ripped up. Huh? Groaned the bus. I know Bertie. He's too small in size to be of any use.
It's a voice that just suits the character down a treat.
Yeah, boo snubs.
Bulgy is based on an AEC Regent V double-decker bus with an open rear platform. And even though Bulgy's friend is never actually seen in the episode, it is said that he's based on an Australian bus. And I love those little details on the signs on him. One saying railway bus, another saying join the anti-rail league, and another one saying free the roads, which would eventually become his catchphrase in the TV series. And the events of this episode are actually based off of a real life event from the Evening Standard. On the 26th of September 1958, a trolley bus being towed through Leeds High Street, Sussex, as its electric pole gets stuck in the underside of a railway bridge. Another great example of Wilbert Awdry basing his stories off of real life events. And all these years later, buses getting stuck under railway bridges is still a common thing these days. Hell, it's happened a number of times in my hometown. It just shows you that some double-decker bus drivers are just too careless to even be having those jobs. And ever since the episode aired, the bridge would become an iconic part of the TV series, making many appearances throughout the TV series after the episode aired. You even get to see Bulgy right beside it as a hen house in various episodes. It's just a nice bit of continuity for the TV series. And the original bridge set itself, along with the Bulgy model, actually has a pride of place in the model exhibition part of Drayton Manor's Thomasland. It just shows how popular this set piece and the character is all these years later. And Bulgy wouldn't have a major appearance again until the 7th series episode Bulgy Rides Again, but we'll get to that in a couple of years' time. And Bulgy's character is a nice change of pace for other road vehicles. I mean, before him we had Bertie the bus, Trevor the traction engine, and Terence the tractor. But all of them are friendly road vehicles who have nothing bad to say about the railways. Sometimes teasingly, but they get along well with all the engines on Sodor. So Bulgy's the first road vehicle who's anti-railway, hating railways and thinking that road vehicles are the superior mode of transport. So it's a nice change of pace to get a villain for the TV series who's not a railway engine. A villain who's a road vehicle. And I absolutely love the scene when Duck goes carefully across the bridge while Bulgy's stuck underneath it. Just the fear in Bulgy's face is just so amusing to watch all these years later.
Stop! He shouted. It might fall on me. That would serve you right for telling lies, said Duck.
Whew, that is harsh, but not completely unfair. I also love Bulgy's fate in this episode, being turned into a henhouse as punishment for his carelessness and his lies. It's another one of those episodes that shows you that you have to face the consequences of your actions, and Bulgy definitely gets his comeuppance in this, because if he hadn't stolen Duck's passages and taken that shortcut, he wouldn't have got stuck under the bridge, and he wouldn't have damaged himself. So he brought that all on himself, a further reminder that karma's a real bitch. Bulgy is an episode that I really look forward to watching all these years later. It's an episode that I didn't get to see that much when I was a kid, but got to see it more often in my teenage years. And I'm really glad that I was reintroduced to it all those years later. It's one of the greatest episodes of the TV series in my opinion. It's got a fun new villain, a fun plotline, and a fun accident for said villain. It's an episode that's definitely worth checking out. One that's not to be missed.
Yeah, boo snubs!
We wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Happy Christmas Day everybody, and today we're going to talk about the 24th episode of the third series, Heroes, based on the magazine stories In a Muddle and the story of the same name written by Andrew Brenner. This would be the last episode in a while for the TV series where Bill and Ben the Tank Engine twins would have a starring role. But is this really a good episode for them to have a last starring role for a few years? Let's take a look. Bill and Ben are working at the quarry and are bored of doing the same thing. Ben asks Bill if he can hear something different, to which Bill replies that he cannot. Ben then states that it is because everything sounds and looks the same and that they need a surprise. Bill is puzzled, but before Ben can say more, the quarry master comes with a message from the Fat Controller that they are to go to the harbour. Bill and Ben hurry to the harbour worried that they did something wrong. When they arrive, the Fat Controller instructs them to shunt trucks at the station while Edward is taking the children on a trip. Next, Bill and Ben meet Gordon, who tells them to behave since they are on the main line. Ben jokingly says that the sight of Gordon made them think that the harbour was the scrapyard. Gordon is furious and orders the twins to make sure that his express is ready by that night. The twins start shunting, thinking they know all about trucks, when they really do not. The trucks claim that they want to help Bill and Ben in organising the yard. The twins accept the offer, unaware that the trucks are playing a trick on them. As a result, when evening falls, the yard has become a mess, causing the twins to be late in bringing Gordon's coaches to the station. The next day, the twins are back at the quarry when they hear a rumble. Ben's driver realises that it is a rock slide. The alarm is raised and the quarry master alerts everyone to evacuate. Bill and Ben wait as the workmen board their trucks. As Bill leaves with his load, the quarry master, having been left behind, shouts for help. Ben waits until he is safely aboard his train and the quarry is evacuated in time for the devastation to take its course. Seeing the wreckage shortly afterward, Bill and Ben hope that the Fat Controller will understand that it was not their fault. The next day, the Fat Controller arrives on board Edward and praises the twins as heroes for saving the workmen. Bill and Ben think that being called heroes is quite a nice surprise. This is an episode I've always enjoyed as a kid. The first time I ever watched it was on a compilation video that contained it as well as other stories. Can't exactly remember the name of that VHS tape, but that was the first time that I've seen this episode. And I've always enjoyed it back then and I still enjoy it to this day. There's just so much to enjoy about it. One good example of this episode being so good is the fact that while Bill and Ben are still cheeky and love to play tricks, they're beginning to grow restless and want a little change from the quarry, since every day is the same thing for them.
Listen, Bill, said Ben. Can you hear something? What sort of something? Asked Bill. Something different, replied Bill. I can't hear anything different, said Bill. Exactly, huffed Ben. Everything is the same. Sounds the same. Looks the same. What we need is a surprise.
I also really love how when they're on their way to the harbour, they're wondering what the Fat Controller wants to tell them. Automatically thinking that they've done something wrong and they're going to get told off.
I wonder what we've done wrong this time, said Bill anxiously. It must be you, replied Ben. Why me? Exclaimed Bill. I've not done anything.
That's a nice fitting little conversation for them before they actually arrive at the harbour, since when the Fat Controller wants to speak to them, they're normally in trouble for doing something wrong. Though it is really funny that they would make that assumption immediately before being told the news in person. It's also really hilarious the banter that they have with Gordon in the episode, which is a nice reminder of the banter they had in the episode Ron Road. And I'm very sure that the scrapyard tease was actually a callback to Ron Road when they thought that Gordon was a pile of old iron. Obviously joking.
Gordon spoke severely to them. You must behave here. You're on the main line now. Actually, Gordon, giggled Ben, when we saw you, we thought this was the scrapyard.
Are we good friends? We've known each other for a long time. We can talk. And there is something I have been meaning to say to you for the last 25 years. Oh, what's that? I hate you! I hate you! I hate you! Go away and crawl away and die in a ditch somewhere, you bastard!
And this shows the trucks being really clever for a change. Rather than just pushing engines down a hill or causing them to crash, they actually cause Bill and Ben to make a muddle of the yard.
No need for that, shouted the trucks as the twins pushed them into place. We'll show you around. We want to help. Thank you very much, said Bill and Ben. The trucks giggled and began their tricks.
Showing that they're more than just troublemakers who just want to see engines come off the line. Showing that they can be quite manipulative when they want to be. And the rock slide at the quarry near the end is just spectacular. It really shows how far the model makers have come with this series. Building a set for the China clay pitch just to have it destroyed near the end of the third series. And the music is just really spectacular, epic and danger-filled. Just how the danger theme of this episode really sounds like the danger music that they used to have in Turks. That's a nice touch from Michael Angelis and Jr. Campbell, and I find it super hilarious how the episode ends with probably the shortest and 3 cheers I've ever heard.
3 cheers for Bill and Ben, our heroes. Hip hip, hooray, hooray, hooray.
That is a hilariously rushed 3 cheers, and I love it for that reason. And the twins wouldn't have a leading role in an episode for the TV series until the 5th series episode Double Teething Troubles. But we'll get to that in a couple of years' time. So for the time, this was really entertaining, showing that there's more to the twins than just their mischievous side, a side that enjoys working hard and wants to see some changes in their lives every now and then. Heroes is another one of those fun and epic episodes, mixing fun and epic into one episode, having the fun parts in the first half of the episode, and having the epic part with the rock slide near the end of the episode. It's a lovely Bill and Ben story that you won't want to miss if you're a fan of the Tank Engine twins, and it's definitely worth rewatching every now and then whenever you want to put the TV series on. Merry Christmas everybody and a Happy New Year. Now if you'll excuse me, those cold turkey sandwiches ain't gonna eat themselves. Nom 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 nom.
Hip hip, hooray, hooray, hooray.
Time to celebrate Boxing Day with Percy, James and the Fruitful Day, the 25th episode of this 3rd series, based on the magazine story Percy Gets Jammed, written by Andrew Brenner. This is one of those episodes that shows off the rivalry between Percy and James, something that the CGI series would often play with. But is it a good way to start off their rivalry? Let's take a look. It is market day on Sodor, and James is on his way to the harbour when he sees Percy at Lower Sudbury. Percy is late with his line of trucks, as he should already be at the next station at that point. James tells Percy that engines should always be on time and puffs away importantly. Feeling resentful, Percy mutters bossy buffers under his breath and continues on his way. James arrives at the harbour to see all the wonderful fresh exotic fruits being unloaded from the cargo ships. James waits as his trucks are loaded, then sets off along the main line. During his journey he meets Thomas and cannot resist boasting. No surprise there. Thomas tells Annie and Clabber that he knows that there will be trouble ahead for boastful James. Back at Lower Sudbury, Percy is busy shunting in the yard when the station master informs his driver that James's brakes are jammed and that Percy is to go and help him at once. Percy quickly sets off and soon finds James stranded on the main line, which gives Percy an opportunity to tease him. Percy's driver soon intervenes and asks Percy if he could push the trucks of fruit, to which Percy happily obliges. Soon Percy is coupled to the trucks and sets off, leaving James fuming. Percy is in a hurry and is not paying full attention to the line. With the trucks in front of him, he has not seen that the points have failed and that he had been diverted onto a siding. Percy's driver sees the danger and applies the brakes, but it is too late. The trucks run straight into the buffers and Percy crashes into the back of the van in front of him. His driver and fireman are jumped clear, but Percy gets squirted and covered from funnel to buffers in squashed fruit. The Fat Controller arrives and sternly reminds Percy that while the point failures are not his fault, the railway is not a jam factory. After that, Percy sadly puffs back home. That night at the sheds, all the engines are silent, with James and Percy feeling very sorry for themselves as they are now both in disgrace. Thomas breaks the silence by reminding everyone that there is more than one way to get into a jam, and that even when engines help each other out, things can still go wrong. One of the engines asks what the point is, and Thomas points out that it means they all learned a lot that day, and therefore they are all really useful engines after all, to which all the engines happily agree. This is one of those episodes that shows off Percy's rivalry with James the Red Engine, and as I said, it's something that would carry on through the TV series, especially during the Andrew Brenner era of the show. And I love the rivalry between these two in the episode, James being the one to start the argument.
What are you doing here, Percy? You should be at the next station by now. You're late. I know, sighed Percy. These trucks have been troublesome all morning. That's no excuse, Percy, snorted James. Nothing should stop us. The Fat Controller relies on us to be on time. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll be on my way. Bossy buffers. muttered Percy.
And then Percy getting his own back later on.
Got yourself in a jam, eh, James? What you might call a sticky situation. Be quiet, said James. It's not funny having jam breaks. And not very reliable either, teased Percy. I am surprised you let it happen, James. Nothing should stop us engines. That's enough, Percy, said his driver. Can you push these trucks? Of course I can, whistled Percy. There's no time to lose. James has done too much of that already.
And it plays off to their different personalities, with Percy being the cheeky one and James being boastful and conceited. And his boastfulness is what starts off the fight between the two in the episode. And it's very satisfying to see Percy getting his own back later on. But rather than just one engine getting punished and the other engine getting off scot-free, both engines get their comeuppances in the end. Because James was in the wrong by boasting to Percy about how nothing should stop the engines and that they should always arrive on time. And Percy was also in the wrong for getting back at James using his own words against him. So both the engines got their karma, neither one of them was completely in the right. And it's a nice change of pace to see two characters get karma come back and bite them in the asses when they're both in the wrong. Because some TV episodes have two bad characters and one of them or sometimes both of them ends up getting off scot-free. But here it shows that neither sides can win when they're both in the wrong. Of course it would have been a different story if either one of these engines was in the right, but because neither one of them were completely in the right, it's very fitting that they both ended up getting their karma. And this is also the first time a character in the TV series angrily says be quiet instead of shut up. Since in the first two episodes it was very common for an angry character to say shut up to someone. But this was the first time they said be quiet rather than shut up. I suppose it was the 90s and they had to change things up a bit since shut up is really rude. And be quiet does sound kinda less rude than telling people to shut up. I don't know the real reason behind it, but I think that's the most likely reason. Since in the 80s nobody really thought twice about these sorts of things. But in the 90s, things started to get a little bit more sensitive towards kids programs. So it was one of those changes that stayed throughout the TV series. And the scene where squash fruit squirts all over Percy is another one of those funny crashes in the TV series. Of course it's still played off seriously, as any crash scene should be in the TV series. But there's also a little bit of humour added to it after the crash happens, where the fruit covers Percy from funnel to footplate. It's just a combination of serious and funny at the same time. A nice combo of the two. And I think it's really nice how Thomas is the one that tells us the moral at the end of the episode. It just shows how much Thomas has matured since his introduction to the TV series.
There's more than one way to get jammed. We all learned that today. What's more, we also learned that sometimes when engines help each other out of a jam, things can still go wrong. So that means we learned a lot today, and therefore we're really useful engines after all.
And another little trivial fact I found out about this episode upon doing research said it was first broadcast in the UK on Sir Ringo Starr's 52nd birthday. I was quite surprised to find that out when I did research for the episode, having it be aired on the birthday of the first storyteller for the TV series. It's really nice in my opinion. This episode is a nice fun episode that shows off the rivalry between James and Percy, two characters that would get their rivalry episodes in the future of the series, especially during the Renaissance era. It's a fun episode that may or may not get you in the mood for fruity snacks, and it's definitely worth checking out if you love funny, entertaining episodes. And so we wrap up Thomascember 2023 with Thomas and Percy's Christmas Adventure, the 26th and final episode of the third series, written by Britt Allcroft and David Mitton. This carries on the tradition from the first two seasons, where we end the series off with a Christmas episode. But how is this Christmas special compared to the first two Christmas episodes? Let's take a look. Thomas might be seen puffing happily along the line, possibly headed towards a small town at Ulfstead, snuggled deep in the heart of Sodor, to greet the villagers. One cold snowy morning, Thomas promises to bring them plenty of parcels, as it's December and Christmas is near. However, the blizzard arrives within a week and Thomas is about to get an extra post truck. Percy is unhappy that he cannot help, but his chance comes when Thomas is forced to give Percy his job in favour of another. Thomas is not pleased with the change, but Percy is delighted and sets off. As he makes his way to the village, a fogman flags him down. He explains that the village is snowed under and that they need snowplows, workmen and a helicopter, so Percy has to leave his trucks on the sidings and go back quickly. Thomas and Percy work together to save the villagers, and Harold and Terence join in. Terence clears the snow and Harold drops food supplies for the villagers. They call the team the best Santa Claus the village has ever had, which confuses Percy. Thomas explains that Santa is a man who brings gifts during the holidays. Percy looks at his funnel, wondering if Santa could go down funnels, and after Thomas clarifies that Santa goes down chimneys, he reminds him that he left his post van in the siding. Henrietta is loaded up with paint pots and parcels the night after Thomas and Percy puff home, while Toby sneaks her along with the villagers on board into the yard. When the engines wake up the next morning, they are surprised to find the sheds decorated and repainted with some parcels that lay everywhere. They all agree that this is the best Christmas they ever had on Sodor. This Christmas episode is really action-packed compared to the first two specials, having introduced us to a new beautiful location on Sodor, introducing the blizzard and then introducing the danger that the village was snowed under. And I love how it takes Thomas, Percy, Terence and Harold to save the villagers. And the exchange between Thomas and Percy about Santa Claus is always a big highlight in the episode every time I rewatch it. It's just a fun little misunderstanding that Percy has when he gets told about Santa by Thomas.
Well done, Percy. Well done, Thomas, cheered the villagers. You're the best Santa Claus this village has ever had. What's a Santa Claus? Asked Percy. Santa Claus is someone who drops presents down chimneys at Christmas time. Percy looked at his phone. I wonder if... No, laughed Thomas. Chimneys, Percy, not funnels.
It's always fun to rewatch all these years later. And I suppose it's impossible to talk about this episode without addressing the controversial American dub. When the episode was brought to America and aired on Shining Time Station, it was renamed Thomas and Percy's Mountain Adventure, and it was aired in the Shining Time Station episode Billy's Party, which was set on Thanksgiving. As so, it was rewritten so that the episode would take place on Thanksgiving rather than Christmas. Now there's many things wrong with this change, because Thanksgiving is a holiday that's celebrated in America, not Great Britain, and it's established that the island of Sodor is in Great Britain. And from a guy who's never really celebrated Thanksgiving because I don't live in America, I'm pretty sure it never snows in November. And I'm also certain that nobody celebrates Thanksgiving with Christmas presents and Christmas decorations. But what the hell do I know, I'm just a Brit. Although I have seen many Thanksgiving episodes over the years since my childhood, like that Simpsons episode from season 2, the various SML videos that take place on Thanksgiving, and that Animaniacs episode with the turkey hunter. So I do have a kind of understanding of Thanksgiving, and the Americans have a turkey meal and show that they're thankful for various things and celebrate. And none of those specials have ever seen the place be covered in snow, nor have people exchanged presents. So even though I don't have a full understanding of Thanksgiving, nor do I celebrate it, I'm pretty sure that this episode is not a great fit to be a Thanksgiving story. And it also gets rid of that fun Santa Claus exchange between Thomas and Percy, which was a highlight in the episode. Now, I can honestly understand them changing this to be a Thanksgiving-themed episode because of the Thanksgiving episode of Shining Time Station that the episode aired on, but I honestly see no reason why they couldn't have just chosen a different episode that's about friendship and being thankful for the TV series and just left this as the Christmas episode it was meant to be. And I've got nothing against Britt Allcroft's decisions, but I also see no reason why she couldn't have made that an exclusive Shining Time Station dub of the episode, and then had the original episode as it was originally intended released later on in the TV series in America. I think it would have been really fun to have heard George Carlin's take on Thomas and Percy's Santa Claus conversation. It's just a shame that the American audiences will never get to see the original Christmas version of this episode unless they find the UK version on YouTube. It's just a real shame that children from America back in those days just never got to experience the episode as it was originally intended. But with all that said, I absolutely love this episode. It just feels so Christmassy. Seeing the whole island covered in thick snow is just always such a delight to me because I love snow and snow-themed episodes. And it should go without saying that Michael Angelis and Junior Campbell upped their game once again for this episode, bringing in those Christmassy themes, as well as a Christmassy theme to the intro theme that came from Bulgy. And the music that plays during the snowstorm scene and the aftermath of the snowstorm is just so whimsical. It starts off being kind of threatening but also kind of whimsical at the same time, as you'd expect with Christmas music. And the scene is just so good that I could just listen to that music and watch that scene for hours on end and still get satisfied with it without any dialogue. It's just that whimsical that I just can't help but rewatch it every time. And one of my favourite shots from the episode is when James is trying to push or pull a bunch of trucks out of a siding. Because of the way it's directed, you can't see James's face, which gives you the illusion that it's just a regular steam engine with no face. And that was the intention that David Mitton went for when filming the TV series at this point. Filming the engines at such angles where you wouldn't think that they're characters, but they're real life machines. It just shows you how much David Mitton knew how to work with the camera and how realistic he wanted the shots to be. I also love that ending shot with the engine sheds being decorated for Christmas. It's just so bright and colourful and just a great way to end the third series on. Thomas and Percy's Christmas Adventure is definitely one of the best episodes of the TV series by far, and it's an awesome and fantastic way to end the third series. It's an episode that I always look forward to watching around Christmas time, and I highly recommend you check it out as well if you haven't for several years. It's one of the best Christmas themed episodes the TV series had to offer, and you won't be disappointed with all the Christmas imagery it provides. And that wraps up all 26 episodes of Series 3 of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. Like the first two seasons of the show, it's been a real blast going through the third series again episode by episode. Getting to see the new adaptations of Wilbert Awdry's stories, as well as stories that were based on stories by Andrew Bretter, future showrunner, and stories that were written by Britt Allcroft and David Mitton themselves. It's a wonderful blend of stories from the original source material and stories that were come up with brand new by the writers and creators of the show. I've had so much fun going through Series 3 episode by episode, just seeing all the Wilbert Awdry related stories and the brand new stories that were come up with by Britt and David. It's been such a blast going through this series as it has been with the first two seasons of the show. And you can expect to see me going through the rest of the Classics series in the upcoming years of Thomascember. So until then, I wish you guys all a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.